There is something about the deep, uninterrupted dark of night that has always called to something ancient within us. Long before cities cast their electric glow across the sky, there was only the moon, the stars, and an ocean of shadow stretching beyond the edge of the firelight. It was in that profound darkness that our ancestors told their most enduring stories, stories born from the rustle of unseen things in the forest, the whisper of the wind over empty moors, and the chilling certainty that just beyond what we could see, another world was stirring. For centuries, the night was not merely the absence of day. It was a canvas for fear, for wonder, and for the myths that helped explain the unexplainable. This was especially true in the medieval world, where the night held a power we can scarcely imagine today. Without modern light to push back the shadows, the world after sunset transformed into a place of mystery and danger and imagination. In candlelit halls and around humble hearths, people spun tales of spectral nights, cunning forest spirits, and creatures that moved only under the cover of the eternal night. These stories were more than simple entertainment. They were a way to give shape to the unknown, to make sense of the fears that crept in when the sun went down. They form a rich tapestry of folklore that has haunted the human psyche for generations. And that is exactly where our journey begins. Over the course of this video, we will explore 30 of the most captivating myths born from the medieval darkness, legends that have echoed through time, sending shivers down spines and igniting imaginations for hundreds of years. We'll meet tragic phantoms bound to moonlit castles, encounter beasts that lurk in the deep woods, and uncover the truths and fears that gave these tales their lasting power. So settle in and let's step together into the twilight, into the realm of whispers and wonder, as we uncover the stories that turn the night from mere absence of light into a world alive with mystery. Our first myth takes us down a lonely, wooded path in the colonial Hudson Valley, but its roots dig deep into the soil of medieval Europe. While Washington Irving's 1920 story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, immortalized the tale in an American setting, the terrifying figure of the Headless Horseman is a specter imported from the Old World. This phantom rider, galloping through the night in a desperate search for his lost head, is a direct descendant of Germanic and Dutch folktales carried across the Atlantic by early settlers. In their homelands, similar apparitions were already ancient, said to be the restless spirits of soldiers who met a gruesome end on the battlefield, condemned to ride the earth until they could recover what was taken from them. Irving masterfully wrapped this folkloric core in the trappings of a medieval romance, presenting it as a found manuscript from the papers of a deceased New York historian. This stylistic choice was deliberate, lending the story an air of antiquity and authenticity that connected the new American landscape to the deep, Gothic traditions of Europe. He set his story in a secluded, sleepy glen, a place where time seemed to stand still and the shadows of the past felt very close. Into this quiet world, he introduced the lanky and superstitious schoolmaster Ichabod Crane, whose wild imagination makes him the perfect victim for the region's most feared legend. The horseman himself is a masterpiece of implied terror. Irving never needs to show us a monster in full. The fear is conjured in the mind of Ichabod and, by extension, the reader. We hear the distant, rhythmic pounding of hooves on the hollow road late at night. We see the looming, headless silhouette against the moonlit sky, and we feel the paralyzing dread as he hurls his spectral pumpkin head. This was the essence of medieval horror, the understanding that the darkest terrors are not what you see, but what you fear might be lurking just beyond the edge of the light. The story endures because it taps into that universal, primal fear of the pursuit, of being chased by an unstoppable force with an unknowable, grim purpose. The Headless Horseman is more than a ghost. He is the embodiment of every unknown danger that waits for us on a dark road, a timeless symbol of the past's violent history galloping relentlessly into the present. While the Headless Horseman represents a very personal, predatory terror, our next myth explores a more subtle and deceptive danger that haunted the medieval landscape. Imagine finding yourself on a lonely footpath, miles from the nearest village as the last sliver of sun disappears below the horizon. The world plunges into an inky blackness, broken only by the faint light of the stars. Then you see it, a soft, flickering glow dancing just above the ground in the distance. It seems friendly, a welcome beacon in the overwhelming dark, perhaps a lantern carried by another traveler. You follow it, hoping for company or guidance, only to find the ground growing soft and wet beneath your feet. The light leads you deeper into a treacherous bog, and by the time you realize it was never a lantern at all, it is too late. You have fallen prey to the beguiling and deadly will-o'-the-wisp. These phantom lights, also known as jack-o'-lanterns or foolish fires, were a well-documented fear across the marshlands and fens of medieval Europe. They were not seen as simple natural phenomena, but as conscious, malevolent entities. Folklore provided two primary explanations for their origin, both deeply rooted in the medieval worldview. In one version, they were mischievous spirits or fairies, whose sole purpose was to lead weary wanderers astray for their own cruel amusement. In another, more haunting interpretation, the lights were the lost souls of sinners or those who could not find rest, condemned to wander the earth and repeat their misleading actions for eternity. The scientific explanation for these lights, which we now understand as marsh gas or methane spontaneously combusting when it contacts the air, would have been utterly incomprehensible to a medieval mind. Without the framework of chemistry and physics, the only logical conclusion was a supernatural one. The light moved with a purpose, it seemed to react to those who followed it, and its appearance was always tied to places of death and decay, the stagnant, decomposing matter of the swamps. This perfectly aligned with the concept of a spirit or demon. The light's elusive nature, always staying just out of reach, made it the perfect representation of a trickster, something that mimicked safety but delivered doom. This myth speaks volumes about the medieval relationship with the natural world. It wasn't just an empty void to be crossed, it was an active, intelligent, and often hostile presence. A simple marsh was not merely wet ground, it was a realm of spirits, a place where the veil between the natural and the supernatural was thin. The will-o'-the-wisp served as a perfect cautionary tale, a story told to children and travelers alike to keep them on well-trodden paths and away from very real physical dangers. It transformed a geological feature into a character, giving a face to the unforgiving wilderness and teaching a powerful lesson about the perils of straying from the known way. If the deceptive glow of the will-o'-the-wisp represents a subtle lure into danger, the next creature on our journey is the very opposite, a being of such brute, terrifying force that it shatters any notion of safety. We travel now to the small English town of Bungay in the county of Suffolk, to a specific stormy Sunday in the year 1577. It was the 4th of August, and during morning service, the heavens opened with a fury that seemed almost biblical. The sky turned black, the wind howled, and a violent tempest of rain and hail assaulted the town. But this was no ordinary storm, for within it came a visitor from a much darker place. As the terrified congregation inside St. Mary's Church prayed for deliverance, a blinding bolt of lightning struck the ground outside. From the heart of this electrical chaos, a monstrous shape emerged. Witnesses described a gigantic, spectral hound, as black as pitch with terrifying, saucer-sized eyes that burned like fiery coals. This was no natural animal. With a savage roar, the beast tore through the solid wooden doors of the church as if they were parchment. Bursting into the sacred space, it charged through the pews, a whirlwind of claws and shadow, and in its wake it left 2 parishioners dead, their bodies strangely shriveled and scorched as if drained of life and burned by some infernal heat. The hellhound then seemed to vanish into the storm as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind the smell of sulfur, scorch marks on the stone floor that some say remain to this day, and a community shattered by a supernatural horror they could never forget. This account, documented in a pamphlet by a writer named Abraham Fleming at the time, is one of the most chillingly specific hellhound encounters in all of English folklore. But the Black Dog of Bungay is far from alone. This myth taps into a deep and widespread vein of European folklore concerning spectral canines, known by many names across the continent. In northern England, it's the Barghest, a monstrous goblin-like dog whose appearance foretells death. In East Anglia, other tales speak of Black Shuck, a name derived from the Old English word scucca, meaning demon. Across the sea in Brittany, the stories tell of the Anku, a grim reaper figure often accompanied by a pack of ghostly hounds. These creatures are almost universally seen as omens of death or disaster. To see one is to receive a grim prophecy, often for yourself or a loved one. What makes the Bungay story so powerful is its visceral violation of sanctuary. The church was the ultimate safe haven in the medieval world, a place consecrated to keep out evil. The fact that this demonic force could so easily invade that protected space during a holy service, no less, spoke to a terrifying truth about the world as our ancestors understood it. The forces of darkness were not held at bay by stone walls or prayers. They were immensely powerful, unpredictable, and could strike at the very heart of a community at any moment. The storm itself was a key part of this narrative, as thunder and lightning were often interpreted as the sounds of a spiritual battle raging in the skies overhead, a battle from which a hellish creature might occasionally fall to earth. While we can now explain the event through a modern lens, a particularly severe electrical storm, perhaps a stray bolt of lightning that hit the church, causing panic and a tragic accident that was then interpreted through a supernatural framework that misses the point of the myth's power. For the people of Bungay, the explanation was clear. A demon had walked among them. The legend gave a shape and a reason to a senseless tragedy, transforming a random act of nature into a story with a monster that could be named and feared. It confirmed their deepest anxieties about the fragility of their safety and the very real presence of evil in their world, a shadow that could crash through the door on even the holiest of days. These legends of predatory ghosts and demonic hounds reveal a world deeply afraid of external, physical evils that could invade from the darkness. But our next myth shows a terror that was somehow even more intimate, a fear that the enemy was not outside the community, but buried within it, waiting to rise from the very earth of the churchyard itself. We now travel to the villages and hamlets of medieval Eastern Europe, where a unique form of mass panic took hold, one that saw communities turn against their own dead in a desperate, gruesome battle against an invisible foe. This was the era of the vampire epidemics. Unlike the aristocratic, romantic vampire of 19th century Gothic fiction, the medieval vampire was a far more visceral and communal terror. It was not a count in a remote castle, but a recently deceased neighbor, a family member, someone you had known your entire life. The fear was that this person had returned from the grave, not with charm and sophistication, but as a bloated, ruddy-faced corpse that would rise at night to prey upon its own kin and form a village, spreading disease and misfortune. The primary evidence for this belief was often a series of unexplained deaths within a family or village, frequently from illnesses like tuberculosis, which wastes the body away. To a pre-scientific mind, this pattern of wasting sickness had only one logical explanation. A parasitic, supernatural predator was slowly draining the life from the living. This belief triggered a shocking ritual. With the permission of local authorities, grieving and terrified villagers would gather to exhume the body of the suspected vampire. What they reportedly found only confirmed their deepest fears. Due to the natural process of decomposition in an airtight coffin, gases would bloat the body, forcing blood up and out of the mouth, making it appear as if the corpse had recently fed. The skin would shrink back, making hair and nails look as if they had grown. To the eyes of the beholder, this was not a body decaying, it was a body that was alive, well-fed, and thriving in its tomb. It was proof positive of the monster in their midst. The prescribed methods of stopping this monster were as brutal as they were logical. The most common practice was to stake the body through the heart, not merely to pierce it, but to pin the vampire to the earth, preventing it from rising. In some regions, the head would be severed and placed between the legs, a symbolic act of ensuring it could never find its way again. In the most extreme cases, the body would be dismembered and burned, its ashes scattered to the wind. These were not acts of desecration born from malice, but desperate acts of survival performed by terrified people. They believed they were surgically removing a plague carrier, a parasite that threatened the very existence of their community. Looking back with modern knowledge, we can see the tragic collision of folklore and pathology at work. Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was known, was a perfect storm for vampire lore. It is a contagion that often passes among family members living in close quarters. Its symptoms include night sweats, pallor, a bloody cough, and a profound wasting away, all of which align perfectly with the classic symptoms of a victim being slowly drained of life by a nocturnal predator. Without germ theory, the idea of an animated corpse spreading death was a coherent, albeit terrifying, model of epidemiology. The vampire myth provided a narrative, a culprit, and most importantly, a ritualized solution that gave a traumatized community a sense of control over an indiscriminate and unstoppable tragedy. It was a way to fight back against the darkness, even if that fight meant confronting the unsettling truth that sometimes the most frightening monsters are the ones we bury ourselves. If the fear of the vampire was a terror of the familiar turned monstrous, our next story presents a very different kind of creation, one born not from malevolence but from a desperate need for protection. We journey now to the late 16th century, to the city of Prague, a place where the shadows of persecution loomed large over the Jewish community confined to its walled ghetto. It was here, according to enduring legend, that one of the most profound and powerful myths of the medieval era was forged, the tale of the golem. The story centers on the city's chief rabbi, a towering historical figure named Judah Lo ben Bezalel, a man revered for his immense wisdom and deep knowledge of the mystical Jewish tradition known as the Kabbalah. Faced with repeated violent pogroms and blood libel accusations, false claims that Jews used the blood of Christian children in rituals, the rabbi sought a solution that went beyond the natural world. Turning to ancient, divine secrets, he decided to create a defender. The process of creation was a sacred, ritualistic act. Rabbi Lo, accompanied by 2 assistants, went to the banks of the Vieltova River at dawn and sculpted a giant figure from the clay of the riverbank. This humanoid form was then brought to life not by a lightning strike or a magical potion, but through the power of language and holy ritual. Through intense prayer and meditation, the rabbi performed the ultimate act of creation. He animated the clay figure by inscribing the Hebrew word for truth, Emet Aleph Mem Tav, onto its forehead. This word, containing the name of God, breathed a semblance of life into the inert matter. The creature, the golem, was immensely strong, utterly obedient, and incapable of speech. Its sole purpose was to patrol the narrow, dark alleyways of the ghetto, a silent, hulking guardian that could detect malice and stop those who wished to bring harm to its people. For a time, the plan worked. The mere presence of this clay protector, this rumor of a silent giant, was enough to deter many would-be attackers. The golem became a symbol of resilience, a literal embodiment of a community's will to survive. But the myth takes a deeply philosophical turn, exploring the ancient warning that to play God is to invite unforeseen consequences. The golem, following its programming without nuance or mercy, began to exert its power too broadly. Some versions of the tale say it started attacking any non-Jew it encountered. Others say its strength grew with each passing day, becoming more difficult for its creator to control. The very thing created to prevent violence was itself becoming a source of it, a blunt instrument that could not distinguish between a real threat and a simple misunderstanding. Rabbi Low realized his creation had served its purpose and was now becoming a danger to the very world it was meant to protect. The act of decreation was as precise as the act of creation. In a powerful scene, the rabbi confronted his own handiwork and erased the first letter, the aleph, from the word emet on its forehead. The word that remained was met, death. With that single symbolic alteration, the divine spirit left the form, and the golem collapsed back into a lifeless mound of clay. Some versions of the legend say the inert body was then hidden away in the attic of the old new synagogue in Prague, where it remains to this day, waiting to be revived only in the city's most dire hour of need. The Golem of Prague is a myth of profound depth, reflecting medieval anxieties that feel strikingly modern. It is a story about the immense responsibility that comes with power, the unintended consequences of creation, and the danger of a protector that cannot be reasoned with. It asks a timeless question. Once we unleash a power, especially one created for our defense, can we truly control it? In an age where we grapple with the ethics of artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons, the Golem's lesson is more relevant than ever. It stands as a powerful metaphor for technology itself, a tool that can be used for great good, but one that, without wisdom and moral guidance, can easily become a mindless force of destruction. The myth provided a narrative framework for a marginalized community to process their vulnerability and imagine a power of their own, while simultaneously offering a universal cautionary tale about the limits of that power. After the intimate, earthbound terror of the vampire and the crafted power of the golem, our next myth explodes across the heavens, a spectacle of cosmic dread that transforms the very sky above into a theater of the supernatural. If you were a medieval farmer huddled inside your home during a raging storm, the world outside was a cacophony of terror. The wind didn't just howl, it shrieked with the voices of the damned. The thunder wasn't just a natural sound, it was the crack of a spectral whip and the pounding of hooves on the clouds. This was the domain of the Wild Hunt, perhaps the most awe-inspiring and terrifying communal myth of the medieval European night. The core of the legend is a ghostly, frenzied procession racing across the sky, typically during the long, stormy nights of autumn and winter. This was no random gathering of spirits. It was a purposeful, violent caravan led by a formidable spectral figure. Across different regions, the identity of this hunter-lord changed, reflecting local folklore and ancient beliefs. In Norse and Germanic traditions, it was often the god Odin himself, known as Woden to the Anglo-Saxons, riding his eight-legged steed Sleipnir at the head of the chaotic parade. In the British Isles, the mantle of leader might fall to the legendary King Arthur, said to not be dead but sleeping and rising in times of great peril to ride again. Other local tales named famous historical figures, notorious sinners, or even biblical characters like Cain as the cursed master of the hunt. Riding alongside this leader was a host of the restless dead fallen warriors, lost souls and damned spirits. The sound of the hunt was a horrifying symphony, the baying of phantom hounds, the blaring of ghostly hunting horns, the furious shouts of the riders, and the relentless, deafening thunder of the horses' hooves beating against the sky itself. To witness this event was considered a dire omen. Some stories claimed that any mortal who saw the hunt would be struck dead or cursed. Others said that if you were caught outside and looked upon it, you might be swept up into the maelstrom, forced to ride with the ghastly host for all eternity, or dropped miles from your home, disoriented and mad. The most common belief was that the hunt's appearance foretold a coming catastrophe, war, plague, or the death of a prominent leader. This myth served a profound dual purpose in the medieval mind. First, it was a powerful explanation for the frightening and unexplainable phenomena of violent weather. Before meteorology, a storm was not a system of low pressure and precipitation. It was a tangible spiritual event. The wild hunt gave a narrative to the chaos. The lightning was the flash of the hunters' weapons. The thunder was the sound of their passage. The gales that tore roofs from houses were the wind whipped up by their furious speed. This personification of the storm made the natural world intelligible. It wasn't random, it had a cause, a leader, and a purpose, however terrifying that purpose might be. Secondly, the myth functioned as a potent social and moral warning. The timing of the hunt was key. It roamed during the holy days of Christmas and the long nights of Yule, a time when the barrier between the living and the dead was believed to be at its thinnest. Its appearance served as a reminder that the dead were always nearby and that moral transgressions could have supernatural consequences. Stories often said the hunt would prey upon those who were outside after dark for no good reason, particularly those who were sinful or had broken social taboos. It was a story told to enforce curfews, encourage piety, and keep communities indoors and together during the dangerous, dark months of the year. The sky itself became a moral compass, and the sound of a storm was a reminder to live a good life lest you attract the attention of the riders in the clouds. Moving from the cosmic spectacle of the wild hunt, we now turn to a terror that was intensely personal and domestic, a haunting that invaded the one place meant to be a sanctuary, the home. Our next story unfolds not in a medieval European village, but on the American frontier in early 19th century Tennessee. The legend of the Bell Witch, while a cornerstone of American folklore, is in truth a colonial echo of fears that were centuries old, a chilling demonstration of how medieval beliefs about witchcraft and demonic infestation crossed the Atlantic and took root in the New World. The story begins around 1815 with John Bell, a farmer and devout Baptist who had settled with his family in Robertson County, Tennessee. At first, the disturbances were minor, almost playful knocking sounds on the walls and doors with no visible source, the sound of rats gnawing on the bedposts, and stones dropping from the ceiling only to vanish upon impact. But the activity quickly escalated into something far more sinister. The family began to hear choking and gagging sounds, as if an invisible force were attacking John Bell himself. Bed covers were ripped from sleeping children, and the family was pinched, slapped, and scratched by unseen hands. The entity soon found its voice, a raspy, whispery breath that eventually matured into the ability to speak, sing hymns, and debate scripture with shocking cruelty and intellect. It focused its particular hatred on John Bell and, to a lesser extent, his daughter Betsy, while often showing a strange fondness for his wife, Lucy. What makes the Bell Witch case so fascinating is that it was never treated as just a ghost story by the community. It was investigated and understood through the lens of witchcraft. Neighbors and local religious leaders concluded that the family was under a witch's spell. This interpretation was a direct import from medieval Europe. For centuries, the belief was that a witch, through a pact with the devil, could send a familiar spirit, a low-ranking demon or imp, to infiltrate a home and torment its inhabitants. These spirits were not full-fledged demons commanding hellfire, but mischievous, cruel, and parasitic entities that acted as a witch's remote agents. The phenomena reported at the Bell farm, the knocking, the physical attacks, the disembodied voice, matched historical accounts of familiar spirits from European witch trial records perfectly. The American frontier, for all its newness, was still processing the world through a very old, very medieval mindset. The entity itself, which came to be known as Kate, displayed a behavior deeply rooted in these ancient beliefs. It claimed to be a witch, but its actions pointed to something more demonic. It could speak at length on religious matters, a trait associated with demons who were believed to be masters of deception and theological trickery. It was also tied to a specific location, another hallmark of a spiritual infestation rather than a human ghost. The legend reached its horrific climax with the slow poisoning and eventual death of John Bell. The entity itself boasted of administering the fatal dose, a final, devastating act that moved the haunting beyond simple mischief into the realm of murderous supernatural evil. The Bell Witch story represents the culmination of a fear that haunted the medieval and early modern home, the fear of inversion. Your house was your castle, your protected space. A malicious spirit represented the ultimate violation of that boundary. It turned the hearth, the symbol of warmth and safety, into a place of danger. It turned the family, the fundamental unit of society, against itself, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and helplessness. The fact that this occurred in a deeply religious community only heightened the terror. Their faith and prayers seemed to have no power over the entity, and in some cases seemed only to fuel its cruelty. While we can look back now and posit modern explanations from mass hysteria and sleep paralysis to outright hoax, this again misses the profound cultural power of the myth. For the Bells and their neighbors, the framework of witchcraft and demonic infestation was the only logical one available. It was a story that gave a name and a reason to the unbearable, inexplicable suffering they endured. The Bell Witch stands as a stark reminder that the darkened forests and stormy skies of Europe were not the only repositories of medieval fear. Those very same terrors, packed into the wagons of settlers, found a new home in the vast, dark woods of America, proving that the most enduring monsters are not those tied to a place, but those born from ideas that cross oceans and centuries. From the haunted farmsteads of the New World, we now turn to an object of unparalleled beauty that is said to contain a world of darkness within its brilliant blue depths. Our journey takes us to the sun-baked earth of medieval India, to the heart of the Golconda mines, where the most spectacular diamonds the world has ever known were pulled from the deep. It was here, according to the legend that would echo for centuries, that a curse was born. The story begins not with a king or a merchant, but with a sacred statue. The myth claims that the massive indigo blue diamond that would become known as the Hope was once not a gemstone at all, but the eye of a revered idol, a depiction of the goddess Sita in a temple. In this version of the tale, a thief, driven by greed and blinded by the stone's beauty, committed the ultimate sacrilege. He braved the temple's sanctity, pried the eye from the statue, and in that single act of violation, unleashed a supernatural retribution that would travel with the stone across continents and through generations. This foundational myth of a sacred violation taps into a near-universal archetype found in folklore across the globe, the concept of the taboo object. To steal from a god is to invite a wrath that is not merely personal but cosmic. The curse was not seen as a simple spell cast by a priest, but as an inherent property of the stone itself, a divine punishment now woven into its very atomic structure. The diamond, now severed from its holy purpose, was believed to carry a spiritual pollution, a darkness that would bring misery and misfortune to any worldly owner who dared to possess it. This belief gave a narrative and a moral framework to the random tragedies that would later be associated with the gem. It transformed the diamond from a passive object into an active, malevolent character in its own right, an agent of karmic justice working its way through history. The diamond's journey from myth into documented history is a path littered with misfortune, and it is this trail of tragedy that gave the curse its enduring power. While its precise path from India to Europe is shrouded in the fog of the 17th century, the legend firmly attaches its curse to the French blue diamond that appeared in the possession of the gem merchant Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, who is often cited as the temple thief himself. The story claims Tavernier met a gruesome end torn apart by wild dogs, a fate that, while historically unverified, perfectly fits the poetic justice of the curse narrative. The gem then found its way into the opulent court of Louis XIV, the Sun King. It was recut to enhance its brilliance and became known as the Blue Diamond of the Crown. Its ownership by Europe's most powerful monarch did nothing to stall the curse's momentum. The reign of Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, both of whom were said to have adored the diamond, ended in the chaos of the French Revolution and their tragic executions by guillotine. The diamond vanished during the looting of the royal storehouse in 1792, disappearing for a generation and only adding to its mystique. When it resurfaced, it had been recut again to conceal its origins, and its cursed legacy seemed to have grown even stronger. It passed through the hands of a succession of owners, each seemingly touched by tragedy. A king of England, George IV, who owned a large blue diamond believed to be the recut stone, was plagued by enormous debt and scandal. It was later acquired by a wealthy American socialite, Evelyn Walsh McLean, who wore the dazzling gem as a good luck charm, seemingly defiant of its dark reputation. Yet her life was marked by profound personal suffering, the early death of her first son, the suicide of her daughter, and the eventual decline of her family's fortune into bankruptcy. Each new calamity was another chapter written in the story of the curse, another piece of evidence that the stone's beauty was merely a lure for a divine punishment that was centuries in the making. What makes the curse of the Hope Diamond such a compelling and enduring myth is the way it seamlessly blends a medieval superstition with the very modern human desire to find pattern and meaning in chaos. We are storytellers by nature, and a simple, random tragedy is often harder to accept than a story with a villain, a victim, and a plot. The curse provides an elegant, if terrifying, explanation for a string of unrelated historical misfortunes. It connects the dots between events separated by decades and oceans, weaving them into a single, satisfying narrative of cause and effect. The diamond becomes the constant, the glittering thread of doom running through history. Furthermore, the curse represents a deep, almost primal anxiety about beauty and danger being two sides of the same coin. The Hope Diamond is objectively breathtaking, one of the most beautiful natural objects ever discovered. The curse warns that such supreme beauty cannot come without a price, that something so perfect must inherently contain a proportional flaw, a darkness that balances the light. It is a story that cautions against desire, against the greed of possession, and against the hubris of believing we can own something with a power and a history far greater than our own. Today, the Hope Diamond rests peacefully behind thick glass at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, viewed by millions of curious visitors. Its curse appears to have been broken, or perhaps it is merely dormant, its purpose fulfilled. It serves as a glittering monument to the power of story, a physical testament to our enduring need to believe that some objects, like the night itself, hold mysteries that can never be fully illuminated. If the haunting of the bell, which showed a spirit invading a single home, and the curse of the Hope Diamond targeted a sequence of wealthy owners, our next myth presents a phenomenon that consumed an entire community, a collective hysteria that turned the streets of a city into a stage for one of history's most baffling performances. In the sweltering July heat of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into the street and began to dance. This was not a dance of celebration or joy. It was a compulsive, frantic, and unceasing movement. She danced alone for days, her feet bleeding, her body exhausted, seemingly unable to stop. Authorities, initially perplexed, decided the best course of action was to let her dance it out, even hiring musicians and providing her space in a guild hall. But this was not a solution. It was a catalyst. Within a week, dozens had joined her. By the end of the month, the number of afflicted dancers had swelled to over 400, all seized by the same irresistible compulsion to dance without rest. The city was in chaos, its heart pounding to the rhythm of hundreds of feet, a rhythm that did not stop for days and weeks on end. This was the dancing plague of 1518. A real historical event so strange it seems to belong entirely to the realm of legend. To the medieval mind, such a bizarre and widespread affliction could only have a supernatural cause. The two most prevalent explanations were demonic possession or divine punishment. Many believed the dancers were victims of a curse, specifically the wrath of Saint Vitus. This saint was invoked for protection against neurological disorders like chorea, which caused involuntary movements. The cruel irony was that failing to properly honor him could result in the very affliction he was meant to prevent. The primary counter-theory was that a demon had taken hold of the populace, perhaps summoned by a witch's spell or simply running rampant due to a lapse in the community's piety. The proposed solutions were just as supernatural as the suspected causes. To break the curse of Saint Vitus, the afflicted were taken to a mountaintop shrine dedicated to the saint and forced to wear red shoes which they were made to dance in until they collapsed from exhaustion. The theory was that the saint, appeased by this suffering, would then relent and lift the curse. We now understand this event through the modern lens of mass psychogenic illness, a powerful phenomenon where psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms in a group of people. But to simply label it as such is to miss the profound social and environmental context that made Strasbourg a tinderbox for such an outbreak. The years leading up to 1518 had been devastating for the region. They were plagued by extreme famine due to terrible weather, which had caused widespread crop failure and horrific food shortages. This famine brought with it the ever-present shadow of disease as malnutrition weakened the population. The people of Strasbourg were living in a state of constant, grinding anxiety, fear, and deep religious dread. Their world felt unstable, unpredictable, and utterly beyond their control. The dancing plague, in a terrifying way, gave this collective anxiety a physical form. The uncontrollable dancing was a perfect metaphor for their lives. They were being jerked around by invisible, powerful forces they could not comprehend or resist. The response of the authorities is a crucial part of the story, as it perfectly illustrates the medieval worldview. Their initial decision to provide musicians and space for the dancers was not mere folly. It was based on a humoral theory of medicine that dated back to the ancient Greeks. They believed the dancers were suffering from hot blood, an imbalance that could be cured by leaning into the movement until the body was purged of the excess heat and the imbalance was corrected. This logical, scientific approach by their standards only worsened the crisis because it validated the behavior and created a stage for the psychological distress to spread. It confirmed to the afflicted and the onlookers that this was a real physical illness that required a specific treatment, thereby deepening the collective trance. The event ultimately only subsided after the dancers were gradually dispersed and, tragically, after many had succumbed to heart attacks, strokes, or sheer exhaustion. The dancing plague stands as a stark and haunting testament to the power of the human mind and the specific terrors of the medieval world. It was not a myth in the traditional sense of a story about a monster, but rather a myth in the making. A real event instantly interpreted and explained through a supernatural framework because no other framework existed. It shows us that sometimes the most frightening forces are not external monsters, but the internal, psychological pressures of a society pushed to its breaking point. The true monster in Strasbourg was not a demon or a cursed saint, but the unbearable weight of famine, disease, and fear. A weight that finally caused the human spirit to break and express its anguish in the only way it knew how, through a desperate, endless, and tragic dance. While the dancing plague revealed a terror born from within the human psyche, our next myth presents a threat that was terrifyingly physical, a monster of tooth and claw that emerged from the deep, dark forests of 18th century France. The year was 1764, and in the remote, mountainous region of Gévaudan, a place where ancient superstitions clung to the landscape like mist, a true nightmare began. It started with the attacks on shepherds and children, those most vulnerable to the dangers of the wild. The first confirmed victim was a young woman named Jean Boulet tending her flock. But she would not be the last. Over the next 3 years, this single beast, or perhaps a pair, would launch over 300 attacks, resulting in an estimated 100 deaths and nearly 50 injuries. The victims were often horrifically mutilated, with their heads frequently severed, a signature of brutality that fueled a panic unlike anything the kingdom had seen. This was not merely a dangerous animal. To the terrified populace, it was something far worse. descriptions from the time paint a picture of a creature that defied easy classification. Witnesses said it was enormous, the size of a calf, with a wolf-like head but a body more reminiscent of a hyena. Its fur was described as reddish-brown with a distinctive stripe down its back, and its tail was unusually long and powerful. Most chillingly, it was said to be preternaturally intelligent, capable of evading traps and seemingly hunting humans not out of necessity but for sport. In a region steeped in folklore, where stories of werewolves and dark forest spirits were part of the cultural fabric, the evidence seemed clear. This was no ordinary wolf. It was a loup-garou, a werewolf, or perhaps a demon sent by divine wrath to punish the people. The beast's apparent immunity to conventional weapons, some claimed musket balls simply bounced off its hide, only solidified its supernatural status in the public imagination. The panic became so immense that it reached the court of King Louis XV at Versailles. The monarch, keen to project an image of strength and benevolence, took a personal interest. He dispatched his own professional huntsmen and dragoons from the royal army, led by the esteemed Captain Jean-Baptiste Duhamel. These were not local farmers with pitchforks. These were skilled men with military training and the best equipment available. Yet, even they were confounded. The beast seemed to vanish into the rugged landscape after each attack, leading the hunters on fruitless chases through impenetrable thickets and foggy valleys. The king's men eventually killed several large wolves, declaring the problem solved, but the attacks continued almost immediately after they left. This failure of royal authority to defeat the monster only deepened the existential dread. If the king's own soldiers could not stop it, what hope did they have? The legend was ultimately ended not by nobility, but by a local commoner, a man named Jean Chastel. The story goes that on June 19, 1767, Chastel, armed with a rifle loaded with silver bullets he had crafted from melted-down religious medallions, faced the beast. As it charged Chastel, a devout man reportedly prayed and fired. The silver shot found its mark, and the creature that had terrorized a nation was finally slain. The use of silver bullets is the most telling detail, a clear import from werewolf mythology. In folklore, only a weapon made of silver could kill a shapeshifter or a demonic beast. By employing this method, Chastel was not just hunting an animal, he was performing a ritual using the tools of superstition to combat a supernatural evil. The beast's body was then paraded through the streets before being sent to the king, though it decomposed long before reaching Versailles, ensuring its mysterious appearance would remain a matter of speculation. From a modern perspective, the most likely explanation is a combination of large wolf attacks and mass hysteria. The region was home to an unusually large subspecies of wolf, and packs may have been forced to prey on humans due to scarce traditional game, potentially exacerbated by a young, aggressive alpha or an animal with a physical deformity that made it a more efficient predator. The sensationalized reporting in the Parisian press, which printed lurid illustrations of a monstrous creature, undoubtedly amplified the fear, turning individual tragedies into a cohesive narrative of a single monstrous entity. The Beast of Gévaudan stands as a perfect, terrifying confluence of fact and folklore. It was a real predator that killed real people, but it was the medieval mindset of the populace that clothed it in the skin of a werewolf, transforming a natural threat into a supernatural legend. It represents the final, bloody gasp of the old world's darkness, a reminder that even in the so-called Age of Enlightenment, the shadows of the forest still held monsters, both real and imagined. After the visceral terror of the Beast of Gévaudan, our journey takes a turn toward a mystery that is less about fear and more about profound, unsettling wonder. We travel now to 12th century England, to the village of Woolpit in Suffolk during the reign of King Stephen. The harvest was underway when, according to chroniclers Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh, something impossible happened. Reapers working in the fields near the ancient wolf pits that gave the village its name stumbled upon two terrified children, a boy and a girl. but these were no ordinary lost youngsters. Their skin was tinged a deep, startling green, a color no one had ever seen on a human being. Their clothing was made from an unfamiliar, strangely textured fabric. And most baffling of all, they spoke in a language that was completely unintelligible to the locals. They were utterly terrified, starving, and alone. The villagers took them in, offering them food, but the children refused everything placed before them. It seemed they were on the verge of starving to death in the midst of plenty until someone brought out freshly harvested raw broad beans still in their pods. The children fell upon them ravenously but showed no knowledge of how to open them. Once shown, they consumed the beans with a desperate urgency, sustaining themselves on this single food for months until they gradually acquired a taste for bread and other common foods. The boy, who was younger and seemingly weaker, soon grew sickly and died, but the girl survived, adapted, and eventually learned to speak English. It was only then that she could tell her incredible story, an account that has puzzled historians and folklorists for centuries. According to her, she and her brother came from a place she called St. Martin's Land. She described it as a twilight realm, a world of perpetual dimness where all the light had the same qualities as the glow of a late evening sunset. The sun never rose, and a great, luminous river separated their world from another brilliant land they could see in the distance. One day, while tending their father's flocks, they heard a loud, overwhelming noise like the pealing of bells, and were suddenly swept up into a chaotic, rushing darkness. When they emerged, blinking and disoriented, they found themselves in the wolf pit in Woolpit, staring up at the blinding brightness of the midday sun, which they found painful to look upon after a lifetime spent in soft twilight. This astonishing narrative, recorded by serious medieval historians, immediately invited supernatural explanations. The most prevalent theory among the people of the time was that the children were inhabitants of the other world. In the rich tapestry of British and Celtic folklore, the earth was believed to be hollow, filled with vast subterranean kingdoms inhabited by the fairy folk. These beings were not the tiny winged sprites of later Victorian imagination, but powerful, human-sized creatures who lived in a world parallel to our own, often accessed through ancient burial mounds, caves, or, quite fittingly, pits. The green hue of their skin was a classic attribute of these beings, often associated with the damp, earthy interiors of their homes or seen as a symbol of their connection to the wild, untamed aspects of nature. Their inability to eat conventional food also aligns with fairy lore, which often states that otherworldly beings can only consume the raw, essential bounty of the earth itself. Another compelling interpretation is that the story represents one of the earliest recorded concepts of a parallel universe. The girl's description of a land of permanent twilight, separated from a brighter world by a shining river, is a startlingly coherent vision of a different physical reality. To a modern ear, it sounds less like a fairy tale and more like a primitive understanding of a multiverse or a dimensional rift. The loud noise that transported them could be interpreted as a sonic boom from a portal between worlds, and their sudden arrival in our world has all the hallmarks of an accidental interdimensional journey. The medieval chroniclers, lacking this vocabulary, did their best to document the account faithfully, leaving us with a puzzle that feels strangely science-fictional in its essence. Of course, many historians have sought a more grounded explanation. One compelling theory suggests the children were real Flemish orphans, lost and starving. During this period, there was significant ethnic violence in the region between native Saxons and Flemish immigrants who had been brought over by the Norman lords. Woolpit was on the edge of a region where these clashes occurred. The children may have fled into the dense, dark forests of the area to escape the violence, becoming disoriented and malnourished. Their green complexion could have been a symptom of chloroses, a form of anemia caused by extreme malnutrition that can give the skin a distinct greenish pallor. Their strange clothing might have been traditional Flemish dress, unfamiliar to the Saxon villagers. their language would have been Flemish, utterly foreign to the local ear. The land of St. Martin could refer to a nearby village, Fornham St. Martin, which had a large Flemish population. The twilight world could be their memory of the deep, dark forest they were lost in, and the loud bells could have been the church bells of nearby Bury St. Edmunds, which might have guided them out of the woods toward the fields of Woolpit. In this reading, the myth is a poignant, misunderstood story of real human tragedy and displacement. The enduring power of the Green Children myth lies in its beautiful ambiguity. It refuses to be pinned down to a single interpretation. It is a story that sits perfectly at the intersection of history, folklore, and speculative fiction. It reflects the medieval mind's attempt to process the utterly unknown, to categorize something beyond their experience by using the frameworks they had available, either the supernatural world of fairy or the simple, tragic story of lost children. The tale gives us a glimpse into a time when the world still felt vast and unmapped, where the borders between the possible and the impossible were fluid, and where a field in Suffolk could, without warning, become a doorway to another world. Our journey now takes us from the tangible mysteries of green-skinned children to a puzzle made of ink and vellum, a book that has defied every attempt to understand it for over 5 centuries. Imagine uncovering a manuscript utterly unlike any other, its pages filled with a flowing, elegant script that looks like it should be readable, yet not a single word makes sense. It is written in an alphabet that matches no known language, a code that has resisted the world's greatest cryptographers, from elite codebreakers who cracked Nazi ciphers to modern supercomputers running complex algorithms. This is the Voynich Manuscript, perhaps the most stubborn and enigmatic book in human history, a medieval mystery that continues to whisper secrets just beyond our grasp. The manuscript itself is a physical object of beauty and strangeness. Carbon dating places its vellum pages between 1404 and 1438, firmly planting it in the early 15th century. Its 240 pages are filled with over 170,000 unique characters, arranged in a script that flows with the confidence of a real language, yet remains utterly impenetrable. But the text is only half the mystery. The pages are lavishly illustrated with paintings that are both meticulous and utterly bizarre. There are hundreds of drawings of plants, but these are no ordinary herbs or flowers. They are fantastical hybrid specimens with roots that look like animal claws, leaves that morph into strange organs, and blossoms unlike anything found in nature. Other sections feature intricate astrological diagrams with zodiac symbols nested inside elaborate, rotating charts of the stars. Perhaps most strangely, there are pages filled with drawings of tiny, naked women bathing together in a complex network of green, interconnected pools and tubes, a section often called the balneological or biological pages. Theories about its origin and purpose are as varied and colorful as the illustrations themselves. One of the most persistent early theories attributed it to the 13th century English friar and alchemist Roger Bacon, suggesting it contained scientific secrets too advanced for his time, which he had hidden in code to avoid persecution from the church. This theory was popularized by a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich, who purchased the manuscript in 1912 and spent the rest of his life trying to prove its Baconian origins, ultimately giving the book his name. Another theory posits it as the work of a skilled hoaxer, perhaps created by the Elizabethan mystic Edward Kelly to swindle the gullible Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who was known to have a keen interest in the occult and was rumored to have purchased the book for a staggering 600 gold ducats. The hoax theory suggests the text is meaningless, a clever forgery designed to fetch a high price from a wealthy patron fascinated by secrets. More modern interpretations delve into the possibility of it being a rare artifact of a lost culture or language. Some researchers have proposed it could be a written record of a now extinct dialect, a unique language isolate whose speakers vanished without a trace, taking the key to their writing system with them. Others have suggested it might be an example of glossolalia, or automatic writing, a stream of text produced in a trance-like state by a medieval spiritualist, meant to convey divine messages that were never intended to be read by human eyes. And, as with any great mystery, there are those who look beyond our world, proposing the manuscript could be of extraterrestrial origin or contain information from a highly advanced, lost civilization like Atlantis. While these ideas capture the imagination, they often say more about our own desire for a fantastical solution than they do about the medieval world that actually produced the book. Perhaps the most compelling theories are those that root the manuscript in the intellectual pursuits of its own time. The herbal and biological sections strongly suggest a connection to medieval medicine and alchemy. The strange plants could be symbolic representations of alchemical processes, where the transformation of base metals into gold was often described using the metaphor of a growing, flowering plant. The bathing women could illustrate a process of distillation or purification, with the green tubes representing alembics and flasks used in an alchemist's laboratory. Another convincing theory frames it as a practical cipher, not for grand secrets but for valuable proprietary knowledge. In an age before patents, a skilled herbalist or early physician might have developed a unique script to encode their most profitable recipes and remedies, protecting their trade secrets from competitors. The text structure, with its repetitive word patterns, does resemble a kind of cipher where common ingredients or procedural steps are represented by specific, repeated code words. The true magic of the Voynich Manuscript lies not in any single theory, but in its relentless defiance of them all. It is a Rorschach test for the ages, reflecting back whatever the viewer most wants to see: a lost language, an alchemist's manual, an elaborate hoax, or a message from another world. It represents the ultimate frontier of the unknown in the medieval era, a tangible reminder that for all we have learned about the past, there are still artifacts that hold their secrets close. It embodies the tantalizing feeling that the answers are right there, visible on the page, yet dancing just beyond the reach of comprehension, a perfect symbol for the eternal night of history where some mysteries are never fully illuminated. From the impenetrable codex of the Voynich Manuscript, we now turn to a story whose narrative is deceptively simple, yet whose melody has echoed with a chilling warning for centuries. Our next stop is the medieval German town of Hamelin in the year 1284, where a promise was broken with a price too terrible to pay. The tale, familiar to many as a whimsical children's fable, is in its original form a deeply unsettling parable born from the heart of medieval anxieties. It begins with a plague, not of sickness but of rats. The town of Hamelin was overrun, its cellars and streets teeming with vermin that devoured grain, spread disease, and brought the community to its knees. In this moment of desperation, a stranger appeared. He was described as a strikingly odd figure, clad in a coat of many colors, a piper who offered the town elders a solution. He promised to lure all the rats from the city with the music from his flute. Skeptical but desperate, the town leaders agreed to his price, a sizable sum of gold for his services. The piper kept his word. He began to play a strange, hypnotic tune on his pipe, and as the melody floated through the air, every rat in Hamelin emerged from its hiding place mesmerized. A seething, furry river of rodents followed the piper as he walked through the town, leading them directly to the Weser River, where they all plunged in and drowned. The town was saved, but when the piper returned for his payment, the town council, seeing the threat was gone, reneged on their deal. They refused to pay him the full amount, offering only a pittance and mocking his simple request. The piper left without argument, but his silence was more threatening than any outburst. He waited. Then, on the 26th of June, a date recorded with chilling specificity, he returned. While the adults were all in church, the piper walked through the silent streets, dressed now not as a simple rat catcher but as a fearsome hunter. He began to play a new, different melody, one that was not meant for the ears of vermin but for the innocent. 130 children of Hamelin, entranced by the otherworldly music, followed him out of the town. He led them to a nearby mountain where a doorway opened in the solid rock. The children followed him inside, and the doorway sealed shut behind them, leaving only two behind: a blind child who could not show the way and a deaf child who had not heard the music. 130 children were gone, swallowed by the earth, never to be seen again. This narrative is far more than a simple fairy tale. It is a historical ghost story. The earliest references to the event are startlingly matter-of-fact. A stained glass window placed in Hamelin's church around 1300, now lost but described in surviving accounts, depicted the colorful piper and the children in white. The town's chronicles begin with the grim entry. In the year 1284, on the day of Saints John and Paul, 130 children born in Hamelin were led away by a piper to Calvary near the Coppen and lost. This entry treats it not as legend but as recorded history. The street in Hamelin where the children were said to have been gathered, the Bungelosenstrasse, still bears the legacy of the tragedy. To this day, no music is allowed to be played there out of respect. Historians have long tried to pin down the real event that could have inspired such a persistent and detailed legend. The most plausible theory is that it is a metaphorical account of a massive migration. In the 12th and 13th centuries, German lords were actively recruiting settlers to colonize lands in Eastern Europe, in regions like Moravia and Transylvania. These land agents, known as locators, would travel from town to town, wearing colorful coats to signify their office, and they often promised young people a new life of opportunity in these new lands. The pipers were these recruiters, and their music was the siren song of a better future. The children of Hamelin may not have been little kids, but the younger sons of the town, teenagers and young adults with no inheritance to look forward to at home. Their departure would have been a devastating economic and emotional blow to the community, a loss that felt like a supernatural punishment for some failure. Another dark theory suggests the story memorializes an outbreak of the plague or some other disaster that literally wiped out a generation of the town's youth, with the piper representing death itself, a familiar figure in medieval art and morality plays. At its heart, the story functions as a powerful medieval cautionary tale with two stark lessons. The first is a blunt warning about the sacred nature of a promise. In a society built on verbal agreements and feudal oaths, breaking one's word was not just a personal failing. It was a social and moral sin that could bring disaster upon an entire community. The elders of Hamelin's greed and hypocrisy literally cost them their future. The second, even darker lesson is a warning about mysterious strangers. The piper is the ultimate outsider, strangely dressed, possessing uncanny skills, and arriving in a time of crisis. He represents the medieval fear of the unknown, the itinerant traveler who could be a savior or a devil in disguise. His magic is not presented as benevolent witchcraft, but as a neutral force that serves whoever wields it. When betrayed, he simply turns its power toward a new, horrifying purpose. The Pied Piper of Hamelin is a story about the consequences of our actions, about the fragility of community trust, and about the terrifying truth that some debts once incurred can never be unpaid. It reminds us that the most haunting melodies are not those that call monsters from the shadows, but those that lead our own children away into the dark. From the haunting tale of lost children and the cryptic whispers of an unreadable book, we now turn to a figure who is not defined by a single event, but by the very passage of time itself. This is the story of a man who did not just witness history, but was condemned to live through all of it, a solitary soul marching through the centuries under the weight of an unimaginable curse. The legend of the Wandering Jew is one of the most complex and enduring myths to emerge from the medieval world, a story that began as a simple folktale but quickly evolved into a powerful and often poisonous symbol that reflected the deepest anxieties of Christian Europe. The core of the myth is arresting in its simplicity. It claims that as Jesus, burdened by the weight of the cross, stumbled on his way to Calvary, he paused for a moment to rest against the doorway of a Jewish man. This man, a cobbler named Ahasuerus in later versions, responded not with compassion but with cruelty and impatience. He taunted Jesus, telling him to move along and not linger. For this act of profound disrespect, Jesus pronounced a terrible sentence. He told the man that because he would not rest, he would know no rest until the end of time. He was condemned to walk the earth, unable to die, until the second coming and Christ's return to judge the living and the dead. In that moment, an ordinary man was transformed into an eternal spectator of human history, a living ghost forever wandering the borders of civilization. This story first began to circulate in a concrete form in 13th century Europe, appearing in the chronicles of monks like Roger of Wendover and Matthew Paris. They claim the tale came from an Armenian bishop who had met the cursed wanderer himself. This was a period of immense social and religious fervor, with the Crusades forging a militant Christian identity and creating a climate where stories that reinforced the spiritual guilt of non-Christians found fertile ground. The wandering Jew was the perfect vessel for this sentiment. He was no longer just a man. He became a personification of the Jewish people as a whole in the medieval Christian imagination, a people cast out from their homeland, destined to wander as a divine punishment for their collective role in the crucifixion. This interpretation provided a theological justification for the rising tide of anti-Semitism, turning prejudice into prophecy and persecution into a perceived fulfillment of a holy curse. The myth exploded in popularity during the 16th century, particularly in Germany following the Reformation. A flurry of pamphlets and broadsides claimed sightings of the wandering Jew, now almost always named Ahasuerus, in cities from Hamburg to Vienna. Each account added new, chilling details to his plight. He was described as a tall, weary man with a long beard, wearing tattered clothing, who would appear suddenly in a town, share his tragic story with anyone who would listen, and then vanish as mysteriously as he arrived. He was said to possess an encyclopedic knowledge of history, having witnessed every war, plague, and revolution firsthand. But his true torment was his inability to form lasting connections or find a home. Every person he ever knew turned to dust, every city he remembered crumbled into ruin, and he remained a constant, aching reminder of his singular moment of callousness 2,000 years before. Yet, for all its use as an anti-Semitic trope, the myth also contained a surprising and powerful counter-narrative of redemption and witness. In some tellings, the wandering Jew was not a figure of scorn but of somber respect. His endless life was a form of penance, and his travels made him a living testament to the truth of Christ's passion. He was a walking sermon, a reminder to every generation of the reality of the crucifixion and the grave consequences of sin and doubt. He served as a memento mori on a global scale, a figure who had seen the rise and fall of empires and could attest to the fleeting nature of worldly power compared to divine judgment. In this light, his curse was also a form of twisted grace, a chance to endlessly atone for his sin and ultimately be present for his own potential redemption at the end of days. The figure of the wandering Jew is the ultimate embodiment of the eternal night. His existence is one of perpetual twilight, caught between life and death, forever moving but never arriving. He is the lonely traveler on the road long after the sun has set, the shadow at the edge of the firelight who has seen things no mortal should. His story taps into a universal human anxiety about time, mortality, and the burden of memory. What would it be like to outlive everyone you love, to see the world change beyond recognition, to hold thousands of years of grief and loss inside you? The myth gives these fears a face and a name. It is a profound moral lesson about the weight of a single action and the search for forgiveness that may never come. a haunting reminder that some sentences are not carried out in a moment, but across the slow, agonizing march of eternity. While the wandering Jew represents an eternal punishment for a single moment of sin, our next myth reveals a terror that could strike any family at any time, for no reason at all, a fear that turned the heart of the home into a place of constant vigilance. In the medieval world, the safety of a child was a fragile thing. Illness was a constant specter, and conditions we now understand medically, from failure to thrive and autism to epilepsy and genetic disorders, were utterly inexplicable. For a society with no concept of germs or neurology, the sudden wasting away of a healthy baby or a toddler's drastic change in behavior demanded an explanation. That explanation often came from the shadows of the forest and the ancient hills in the form of a chilling supernatural theft. This was the pervasive, deeply personal fear of the fairy raid and the changeling. The belief was both simple and horrifying. The fairies of medieval folklore were not the benevolent, tiny sprites of later children's tales. They were powerful, immoral, and often hostile beings who lived in a parallel world of breathtaking beauty and danger just out of human sight. They were enchanted yet envious, coveting the one thing their magical realm could not provide: human vitality. It was believed that the fairies, particularly their aristocratic rulers, the Shia in Celtic lands, sought to strengthen their own fading bloodlines by stealing healthy, beautiful human infants, especially those who had been unbaptized and were therefore not yet fully under the protection of the Christian God. In their place, they would leave one of their own, a wizened, sickly fairy child, or sometimes a crafted replica made of wood that would appear to sicken and die, a decoy known as the changeling. The signs of a changeling were specific and heartbreaking. A mother might wake to find her once plump and happy baby had become thin, restless, and perpetually irritable, with a wailing cry that seemed endless. The child might refuse to eat, its features seeming to grow sharp and ancient overnight, its gaze unnervingly knowing and distant. A child who had begun to speak might suddenly stop, or one who had been walking might regress. These were all classic symptoms of what we would now diagnose as various childhood illnesses or developmental disorders, but to a medieval parent, they were undeniable proof that the being in the cradle was not their own flesh and blood, but a fairy impostor left to die while their true child was raised in luxury under the hills. This belief triggered a complex set of protective rituals that permeated daily life. The most important defense was the sacrament of baptism, which was believed to place a spiritual shield around the child, making it unpalatable to the fairies. Until that could be arranged, parents would take extraordinary precautions. A pair of open iron scissors, a metal they were said to fear, was often hung over the cradle. The child's clothing might be put on inside out to cause confusion, or a dab of soot might be placed on its forehead to disguise its beauty. Parents were cautioned never to praise a child too highly in front of an open window or door, lest the fairies overhear and be tempted. Leaving a child unattended, even for a moment, near a hearth or a threshold, places considered liminal spaces between worlds, was seen as an open invitation for abduction. If these precautions failed and a child was suspected of being a changeling, the methods used to force the fairies to return the original were often brutal. The logic was cruel but consistent. Since the fairies valued the human child for its health and beauty, they would not want a damaged or tortured substitute returned to them. Therefore, parents might subject the changeling to terrifying ordeals designed to make the fairies relent. The child might be held over a hot fire, or fed a brew of bitter herbs, or abandoned on a dung heap, or in the most extreme and tragic cases, beaten or burned. The idea was not to kill the fairy child, but to make its existence so unpleasant that its kin would have no choice but to come back and reverse the swap. From a modern standpoint, these acts seem like horrific child abuse, and indeed, many historical accounts of infanticide were likely justified by changeling claims. But to view them only through that lens is to misunderstand the profound psychological context. For a loving parent, the belief that the wasting, screaming creature in the cradle was not their child but an evil imposter was a coping mechanism of last resort. It was a way to make sense of an unbearable tragedy. The rituals, however violent, were not acts of malice but desperate acts of love, a final, horrific attempt to rescue their real child from a magical kidnapper. The changeling myth provided a narrative for the unexplainable, a target for parental grief and rage, and a grim, desperate hope that through these extreme measures, a stolen child could still be brought back home from the eternal twilight of the fairy realm. Our journey now takes us to the heart of medieval Poland, to the royal city of Krakow, where a terror of a far more physical and fiery nature haunted the banks of the Vistula River. High atop Wall Hill, in a dark, gaping cavern beneath the castle itself, lived a creature of pure appetite, the infamous wall dragon. This was no subtle spirit or elusive phantom. It was a beast of scale and flame that demanded a daily tribute of cattle, leaving a trail of devastation and fear throughout the kingdom. If the people failed to provide this grim offering, the dragon's wrath was swift and terrible, breathing jets of fire that could consume homes and livelihoods in an instant. The creature's lair, positioned directly below the seat of power, made its threat inescapable, a constant reminder to the king and his subjects alike that they lived under the shadow of a monstrous predator. Faced with this seemingly unstoppable force, the kingdom's greatest knights and warriors stepped forward, their armor gleaming, their swords sharp, their courage unquestionable. They represented the traditional medieval solution to a monster problem, direct, heroic confrontation. One by one, they challenged the beast, and one by one, they were defeated, their valor and steel proving useless against the dragon's armored hide and torrents of fire. This repeated failure of conventional martial prowess is a crucial element of the myth. It tells us that some monsters cannot be slain by brute force alone. They require a different kind of hero and a different kind of weapon. That hero emerged not from the knightly class, but from the most humble ranks of society, a young shoemaker's apprentice named Scuba. While the knight saw a foe to be fought, Scuba saw a problem to be solved. He observed the dragon's behavior, its predictable hunger, and its simple animal nature. His solution was one of breathtaking cleverness and cruel ingenuity. He acquired a large sheep, slaughtered it, and stuffed its carcass not with straw, but with a potent mixture of yellow brimstone, what we know as sulfur, and other noxious chemicals. He then carefully sewed the sheep back together and left this deadly offering near the entrance to the dragon's cave. The creature, driven by its endless hunger, emerged and devoured the sheep in a single gulp. For a moment there was silence. Then the dragon's own biology became its executioner. A terrible, burning thirst ignited within its belly, a chemical fire that water could not quench. In agony, the beast stumbled down the hill and began to frantically drink from the Vistula River. It drank and drank, gulping down half the river itself, until the immense internal pressure from the expanding sulfur gases and water caused the dragon to swell and violently explode, scattering its remains across the bank. The city was saved not by a sword thrust, but by a clever trick, a lesson in chemistry, and a profound understanding of a monster's own weaknesses. The legend of the wall dragon offers a fascinating glimpse into the medieval mind, revealing a more complex view of heroism and problem-solving than we often assume. On one level, it is a classic folktale of the clever commoner outwitting a mighty foe, a narrative that would have resonated deeply with a peasant class accustomed to relying on their wits to survive. But on a deeper level, the story can be interpreted as a metaphor for the very real, non-mythological challenges faced by the city. Krakow, like many medieval settlements, was plagued by recurring, devastating fires that could quickly consume its wooden buildings. The dragon may have been a personification of this ever-present danger, its fiery breath representing the uncontrollable blazes that periodically ravaged the city. Furthermore, the Dragon's Cave was a real place, a known limestone cavern at the base of Wall Hill that still exists today, known as the Dragon's Den. In antiquity, it likely served as a shelter, but by the medieval period, it may have become a den for bandits or a hideout for outcasts who preyed upon the city. The dragon, they feared, could have been a very human monster, a ruthless criminal leader whose reign of terror was finally ended not by our army, but by the cunning strategy of a local who knew the lay of the land better than any armored knight. The sulfur-stuffed sheep in this reading becomes a symbol for a well-planned ambush or a clever trap that used the criminal's own greed against him. Ultimately, the myth's enduring power lies in its celebration of intellect over brutality. The dragon was not defeated because Scuba was stronger, it was defeated because he was smarter. He used observation, knowledge of materials, and a deep understanding of cause and effect to solve a problem that had stumped the kingdom's traditional protectors. The Wall Dragon remains Krakow's most beloved legend, not because it features the biggest monster, but because it features the most ingenious hero, a testament to the idea that the greatest weapon against the darkness is not a sword but a clever mind. If the Wall Dragon presented a physical monster that could be outsmarted, and the changeling a threat that could be identified through strange behavior, our next myth presents a terror that strikes at the very core of the self. Imagine walking down a lonely castle corridor, the only light coming from a flickering torch in a wall sconce. The stones are cold, the air is still, and the only sound is the echo of your own footsteps. Then you turn a corner and freeze. There, standing before you, is your perfect mirror image. It wears your clothes, bears your face, but its eyes hold a chilling emptiness. Before you can cry out or reach out to touch it, the figure turns and melts into the shadows, leaving you alone with a paralyzing dread. In the folklore of medieval Germany and Scandinavia, such an encounter was not a curious oddity, it was the worst omen imaginable. You had just met your doppelganger, and its appearance signaled that your death was imminent. The word itself comes from the German doppel, meaning double, and genger, meaning goer or walker. But this was no harmless twin. The doppelganger was a spectral duplicate, a paranormal copy of a living person that existed independently of its original. Medieval belief held that seeing this phantom self was a direct preview of one's own fate, a supernatural warning that could not be prevented or avoided. The doppelganger was not the cause of death, but rather a herald, a sign that the threads of one's life were about to be severed. In some tales, the double would be seen performing an action the real person would do just before dying, or it would appear in a location the person was about to perish in, solidifying its role as a grim preview of destiny. This fear was deeply intertwined with medieval concepts of the soul and identity. The human form was seen as a sacred vessel, unique and indivisible. The sudden, unauthorized appearance of a perfect copy suggested a fundamental tearing of the spiritual fabric. It implied that the soul itself was not secure within the body, that it could be duplicated, stolen, or lured away. The doppelganger was often interpreted as a form of soul theft, where a malevolent spirit or demon had crafted a duplicate of a person in order to siphon away their vitality or damn them by committing sins in their likeness. This played into a profound anxiety about the fragility of the self in a world filled with invisible, deceptive forces. If you could not trust your own eyes, if you could not be certain that the face you saw was truly your own, then reality itself became unstable. Some of the most chilling accounts come from the biographies of prominent figures, where the appearance of a double was recorded as a supernatural fact. The story is told of Queen Elizabeth I of England, who, lying on her deathbed, was reportedly seen by her ladies-in-waiting in a room elsewhere in the palace, fully dressed and looking as she had in her youth, just moments before her passing. While this account may be apocryphal, it perfectly illustrates the myth's power. The double was a phantom of the self, detached from the dying physical body, already moving on. In a more localized German tale, a farmer was said to have seen his own double walking across a field he was plowing. The figure stared at him with a sorrowful expression before vanishing. The next day, the farmer was killed when his cart overturned. In these stories, the doppelganger is not malicious but mournful, a silent messenger from a future that is already written. Beyond a simple death omen, the myth also served as a powerful narrative device to explore themes of guilt, duality, and the divided self. The double often appeared during a period of intense moral crisis for the individual, reflecting a deep internal conflict. A person wrestling with a terrible secret or a sinful impulse might project that hidden aspect of their personality outward, manifesting it as a doppelganger that then haunted them. In this sense, the double was not an external monster, but a manifestation of the darkness within, a walking embodiment of a guilty conscience that ultimately led its original to a state of self-destruction. The doppelganger was the ultimate supernatural confirmation of the old adage, "You are your own worst enemy." It gave a physical form to the internal shadows that plagued the medieval mind, proving that the most terrifying monster of the eternal night might not be waiting in the forest but staring back at you from the other side of the mirror. And from the fear of confronting your own spectral double, we descend into a far more tangible and grisly corner of the supernatural, where dark magic was not a matter of spectral omens but a crafted tool for a very specific criminal purpose. In the shadowy world of medieval folklore, few objects are as simultaneously horrifying and practical as the Hand of Glory. This was not a myth about a monster to be feared, but a recipe for a magical device to be used, a chilling instruction manual born from a brutal blend of superstition and outright burglary. The core belief was as simple as it was macabre. The severed hand of an executed criminal, prepared through a specific and gruesome ritual, could grant a thief the ultimate power over his victims. It was said to render everyone in a household into a state of death-like slumber, making them completely unaware of the intruder moving through their home, and could even force locked doors and chests to spring open at its touch. The creation of a Hand of Glory was a ritual in itself, requiring precise timing and a stomach of iron. The instructions found in various grimoires and books of folk magic across England and Europe were very specific. First, one had to acquire the right ingredient, the left hand of a man who had been hanged on the gallows, preferably a murderer. The timing of the severing was crucial. It was to be cut from the body under the cover of a new moon or on a dark, stormy night, often as the corpse still swung from the gibbet. The freshly severed hand was then tightly wrapped in a shroud of cloth and squeezed to drain it of any remaining blood. Next came the preservation process, which could involve pickling it in a jar with salt, pepper, and saltpeter for a fortnight, or, in the most common version of the recipe, curing it in an oven or over a fire fueled by vervain, a herb sacred to the Druids. The final, essential step was to fashion candles from the hand's own rendered fat, or to place a candle made from the fat of a malefactor between its clenched fingers. When this ghastly candle was lit, its light would be visible only to the thief himself, casting the rest of the house into an impenetrable magical darkness and activating its sleep-inducing power. With this monstrous tool prepared, the thief could then operate with impunity. The law states that as long as the candle flickered in the Hand of Glory, every person inside the targeted building would fall into a coma-like trance from which they could not be awakened. Stories tell of burglars moving silently from room to room, stepping over slumbering families, all while the eerie, localized flame of the hand candle illuminated their path to the family strongbox. The hand was also believed to be a master key. Held against a locked door, it would cause the bolts to slide back and the locks to disengage on their own. This made it the perfect supernatural tool for a profession that relied on stealth and access. It was the ultimate fantasy for the medieval criminal, a guarantee of a successful, risk-free job, provided one had the nerve to first procure and prepare one of the most taboo objects imaginable. The terrifying efficacy of the Hand of Glory, however, was not without its counters. Folklore provided householders with a few desperate methods to break its power and repel the witch thief. The most common countercharm was to anoint the thresholds of all doors and windows with a specially prepared ointment made from the blood of a screech owl mixed with the grease of a pig. Alternatively, one could create a paste from the gall of a black cat and the fat of a white hen, smearing it across the door frames. Perhaps the most straightforward defense was to simply extinguish the infernal candle, though this was said to be impossible by normal means. The only way to snuff out the flame was to douse it with milk or, in some versions, to piss on it. A vulgar but effective solution that appealed to a very base human defiance against the sophisticated dark arts. These counterspells reveal the deep-seated domestic anxiety the myth preyed upon. In an age without police forces or reliable locks, the home was vulnerable. The Hand of Glory was the personification of that vulnerability. It was the fear that a criminal could not just break your lock, but could magically neutralize your entire family, leaving you utterly helpless in your own bed. While the Hand of Glory represents a dark, practical magic born from crime and superstition, our next myth hurtles us forward into the 20th century, where an ancient curse would collide with the machinery of modern war with terrifying precision. In the ancient city of Samarkand, in what is now Uzbekistan, lies the Gur-e-Amir Mausoleum, the final resting place of one of history's most fearsome conquerors, Timur, also known as Tamerlane. This 14th century warlord forged an empire out of blood and iron, building pyramids of skulls from his defeated enemies and leaving a legacy of unmatched brutality. But it was not his life of conquest that would birth his most enduring legend. It was the prophecy sealed within his tomb. An inscription on his immense jade grave marker carried a warning etched in stone for any who would dare disturb his eternal slumber. "When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble." Another variation was even more direct and chilling. "Whosoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." For nearly 6 centuries, that warning went unheeded. The tomb stood as a monument to a brutal past, its curse a curious footnote for historians. Then, in June of 1941, a team of Soviet anthropologists and archaeologists, led by Mikhail Gerasimov and under the direct orders of Joseph Stalin, arrived at the mausoleum. Their mission was a blend of science and Soviet propaganda: to open the tomb, verify the identity of the remains, and use Gerasimov's pioneering forensic reconstruction techniques to create a bust of the great conqueror. Local elders and Muslim clerics pleaded with the scientists to stop, begging them to respect the curse and leave the tomb sealed. They warned that disturbing Timur would unleash a catastrophe beyond imagining. The scientists, men of reason and atheism, dismissed these concerns as primitive superstition. On June 20, 1941, they pried open the great stone lid of the sarcophagus. Inside, they found confirmation of the historical accounts. The skeleton revealed a man who had been tall for his time and lame in one leg, supporting the name Timur the Lame or Tamerlane. They also found further inscriptions within the tomb that seemed to reinforce the curse. Yet the true horror began not inside the tomb but outside it. Just 2 days after the Soviets broke the seal, on June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest and most brutal invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers poured across the Soviet border, catching Stalin's forces completely by surprise and beginning a conflict of unimaginable scale and savagery that would become the Eastern Front of World War II. The seemingly supernatural timing was uncanny. The opening of a tomb warning of a terrible invader had been followed within 48 hours by the arrival of the most terrible invader of the modern age. The coincidence sent a shockwave through the Soviet team and the local population. The scientists had scoffed at the curse, but now, as the Wehrmacht advanced relentlessly toward Moscow, claiming millions of lives, the legend felt less like a superstition and more like a dreadful prophecy fulfilled. The story spread like wildfire among Soviet troops, becoming a potent piece of wartime folklore that spoke to a deep, existential fear. The scientists, reportedly shaken, worked quickly to complete their study. In a desperate attempt at appeasement, they arranged for Timur's remains to be given a full Islamic reburial with full religious rites in December of 1942. This act of respect, according to the legend, directly turned the tide of the war. The pivotal Soviet victory at the Battle of Stalingrad, which began its encirclement of the German Sixth Army, commenced just weeks after the proper reburial was complete. From a rationalist perspective, the connection is, of course, a profound and tragic coincidence. The plans for Operation Barbarossa had been in motion for months. The date of the invasion was set by military logistics and strategy, not by the actions of a team of archaeologists 1,000 miles away. The Soviet Union's initial disastrous military performance was due to Stalin's purges of his own officer corps and his refusal to believe intelligence reports of an impending attack. Yet, to focus solely on the historical facts is to miss the immense cultural and psychological power of the myth. For the people of Uzbekistan, the curse affirmed the sacredness of their history and the wisdom of their ancestors against the arrogant rationalism of a foreign power. For the average Soviet soldier hearing the story in a muddy trench, it provided a narrative for the incomprehensible horror unfolding around them. The war was so vast, so chaotic, and so evil that it felt biblical in its scale. The idea that it could have been unleashed by a single, sacrilegious act gave a strange, dark sense of order to the chaos, a reason for the madness. The curse of Tamerlane stands as a stunning example of how ancient myths can violently intrude upon the modern world, forcing a collision between belief and reason. It demonstrates that a curse's power lies not in its objective truth, but in its timing and its ability to provide a story where none exists. It is a legend that gave a 14th century conqueror one final, devastating victory over the 20th century, proving that some warnings carved in stone and whispered through generations have a power that can make even the most hardened atheist pause and wonder if the eternal night holds forces we are not meant to disturb. Moving from the calculated sacrilege of Tamerlane's tomb, we confront a creature whose very existence was an abomination, a being so vile that its mere glance could curdle the blood and shatter stone. In the bestiaries and alchemical texts of medieval Europe, few monsters were as universally feared as the basilisk, the serpent king born from a paradox and hatched in sin. This was not a beast that stalked its prey. Its presence alone was a weapon. The mythology of its origin is as bizarre as its powers, a clear example of the medieval mind categorizing the unnatural. It was said the basilisk began its life as a small, perfectly spherical egg, devoid of a yolk, laid not by a serpent but by a 7-year-old rooster. This egg, itself a violation of the natural order, had to be incubated not by a hen but by a hideous toad, often in a dung heap or a place of filth. From this unholy union of a male chicken and a creature of poison emerged the ultimate embodiment of corruption, a serpent crowned with a white spot or a diadem, earning it the title the King of Serpents. Its methods of killing were what made it a legend of pure dread. Direct eye contact was instant, unavoidable death, but its horror did not stop there. Its breath was so venomous it could wither plants and shatter rocks, and its mere presence could poison wells and corrupt the very air for miles around. This made the basilisk the perfect mythological explanation for a host of terrifying, inexplicable real-world tragedies. A traveler found dead on a remote path with no visible wounds. A basilisk's gaze from a roadside thicket, an entire village falling ill from a contaminated well. A basilisk had merely slaked its thirst there. The sudden, mysterious death of livestock, the failure of crops in a specific field, the collapse of a mine shaft, all could be neatly, terrifyingly explained by the passing of this wretched creature. It was a catch-all monster for sudden communal disaster, giving a name and a form to the invisible menace of disease and miasma long before the discovery of germs. Yet for all its power, the basilisk was not invincible. Medieval wisdom, in its fascinating logic, prescribed very specific methods for defeating it, turning the hunt into a battle of wits and natural philosophy rather than brute force. The most famous method involved the use of a mirror. A brave or perhaps foolish soul could theoretically advance upon the basilisk's lair holding a polished silver mirror before them. The theory was that the creature's own lethal gaze, reflected back upon itself, would be its undoing. This was a beautifully symbolic solution. The monster of corruption was destroyed by its own evil nature. Other remedies relied on the concept of antipathy in nature. The weasel was said to be immune to the basilisk's gaze and could be sent into its burrow to fight and kill it. In some tales, the crow of a rooster was so horrifying to the basilisk, the symbolic sound of its unnatural father, that it would cause the creature to seize up and die. Perhaps the most practical and darkest method involved sending a man to his certain death. A party of hunters would send one of their number ahead, armed only with a spear. Knowing he was doomed the moment he laid eyes on the beast, this sacrificial scout would locate the basilisk and, in the split second before he died, thrust his spear into the ground to mark the spot. His companions, watching from a safe distance, could then either collapse the burrow on top of the monster or send in a weasel to finish the job. This grim tactic highlights the sheer terror the basilisk inspired. It was a creature worth sacrificing a life to eradicate. Beyond its role as a plot device in monster hunts, the basilisk myth served a deeper, almost alchemical purpose. It was a personification of purification through confrontation. The idea of using a mirror or a weasel was about turning the monster's own power against it, about using the natural world to correct an unnatural imbalance. Its presence explained the unexplainable, but its destruction reaffirmed humanity's ability to restore order and cleanse corrupted spaces. A small but vital victory in a world filled with invisible, deadly threats. Though written by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato centuries earlier, the story of the Ring of Gyges found a vibrant and ominous second life in the medieval imagination, transformed from a philosophical thought experiment into a potent legend of a literal magical artifact. In Plato's Republic, the tale is told of a humble shepherd named Gyges who discovers a bronze horse containing a corpse wearing a golden ring. He takes the ring and soon discovers that by turning its bezel, he becomes completely invisible. With this new power, he seduces the queen, murders the king, and seizes the throne of Lydia for himself. For Plato, this was a hypothetical question about the nature of justice. Would any person, freed from all fear of consequence, remain moral? But when this story was retold in candlelit medieval halls, its meaning shifted dramatically. The ring was no longer an abstraction. It was a real, tangible object that could be lost, found, and coveted, a perfect device for exploring the era's deepest anxieties about power, secrecy, and the human soul. The concept of an object granting invisibility resonated profoundly with the medieval worldview, where the knight was already a cloak for both the righteous and the wicked. A common folktale archetype emerged across Europe. The story of a poor, downtrodden soul, a woodcutter, a dishonest servant, a cunning thief, who stumbles upon a magical cap, a cloak, or most often, a ring that could render its wearer unseen. These stories were often framed as comedic cautionary tales. The protagonist would use their newfound power to play pranks, steal food from the king's table, or learn the secrets of their neighbors. Yet the tone almost always darkened. The initial thrill of mischief would inevitably give way to more serious crimes, theft, betrayal, and sometimes murder. The narrative arc was clear. The power of invisibility did not create a new criminal. It simply revealed the one that had always been lurking inside, unchained from the constraints of society and the fear of God's all-seeing eye. This reflected a core tenet of medieval Christian morality, that true virtue was what one did when no one else was watching. The gaze of the community and the church acted as a constant enforcer of behavior. The Ring of Gyges, in its mythical form, represented the ultimate removal of that gaze. It created a perfect moral vacuum, and the stories asked a terrifying question: what would fill that void? For most protagonists, the answer was sin. The ring became a metaphor for the intoxicating and corrupting nature of hidden power. It was a narrative embodiment of the temptation faced by every person in a position of authority. The lord alone in his chamber with his tax records, the merchant weighing his goods in the back of his shop, the priest hearing a confession. The power to act without witness was the ultimate test of character, and the folklore suggested that most would fail. Beyond personal morality, the myth also spoke to a pervasive political fear. In a society rigidly structured by feudalism, where power was supposedly ordained by God and visible for all to see in the form of crowns, castles, and coats of arms, the idea of an invisible ruler was deeply unsettling. A king was meant to be a spectacle, his authority performed through public pageantry and visible might. An invisible man on the throne was the ultimate subversion of this order: power without accountability, influence without source, a hidden hand guiding the fate of the kingdom. This fear can be seen echoed in the period's obsession with courtly intrigue, hidden poisoners, and whispered conspiracies. The Ring of Gyges gave a magical form to the very real anxiety that the true rulers were not who they seemed to be, that the strings of power were being pulled by unseen, and therefore unaccountable, forces lurking in the shadows of the castle keep. The legend's endurance is a testament to its profound insight into a timeless aspect of the human condition. It provided a framework for understanding how easily morality can erode when the lights go out and the curtains are drawn. It gave shape to the suspicion that the neighbor smiling at you in the market by day might be plotting against you in the secrecy of his own home by night. The Ring of Gyges, in its journey from Platonic dialogue to medieval folklore, became more than a story about a magic ring. It became a dark mirror held up to society, reflecting the unsettling truth that the darkness we fear most in the eternal night is not the monsters that might be hiding in it, but the monstrous potential for corruption we might find within ourselves if we ever truly believed we could get away with it. For the medieval sailor, the map was not merely a tool for navigation. It was a tapestry of known realities and whispered legends, a document where the solid ground of the coastline gave way to the swirling mists of the unknown. Beyond the edges of the known world, cartographers would often inscribe a simple, chilling warning: "Hic sunt dracones, here be dragons," but sometimes they would chart something even more tantalizing: solid land. Sprinkled across the vellum and parchment of Portoland charts were phantom islands, places like High Brassel and St. Brendan's Isle, drawn with confidence and detail despite the fact that no one could ever seem to find them twice. These were not simple cartographic errors, they were expressions of a deep-seated human need to fill the terrifying void of the ocean with something, anything, even if it was a mirage born from hope, fear, and the distorting lens of a sea fog. Perhaps the most famous of these elusive lands was High Brassel, a spectral island said to lie somewhere in the mist-shrouded waters of the North Atlantic, off the western coast of Ireland. Unlike the foreboding reputation of some mythical places, High Brassel was often depicted as a place of immense beauty and advanced civilization. Its name is derived from the Irish Uí Bresail, meaning descendants of Bresail, and is connected to an ancient Celtic clan, but its legend was amplified by a potent cocktail of Irish myth and sailors' yarns. On maps, it was typically drawn as a perfect circle, often with a wide channel or river cutting directly through its center, a distinct and memorable geography that made its failure to appear on any consistent set of coordinates all the more frustrating for explorers. The lore said it was a paradise, a land of eternal youth where a race of enlightened priests or monks lived in peace and possessed great wisdom and gold. The catch was that the island was almost always cloaked in a thick, impenetrable mist, becoming visible to human eyes for only one single day every 7 years, a fleeting chance to glimpse its verdant shores before it vanished once more beneath the waves or back into the fog. This myth proved so persistent and so alluring that it actually launched real voyages of discovery. In the 15th century, the wealthy English merchant John J.J.R. sponsored an expedition that spent over 2 months searching for the island, only to return empty-handed. Later, the navigator Pedro de Ayala reported to the Spanish monarchs that men from the English port of Bristol had indeed found the legendary Isle of Brasil, lending just enough credibility to keep the dream alive for another generation. These expeditions were not mere fool's errands. They were driven by a powerful economic and spiritual imperative. In an age of limited geographical knowledge, the existence of a wealthy, unknown island was a gamble worth taking. The failure to find it did not kill the myth. It simply added another layer to its legend, with sailors claiming that those who did find it were either enchanted to stay forever or were somehow unable to ever locate it again, as if the island itself decided who was worthy of its secrets. A similar but even more spiritually charged phantom was St. Brendan's Isle. This legend grew from the incredible voyage of St. Brendan the Navigator, a 6th century Irish monk who, according to the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, embarked on a 7-year journey across the Atlantic in a simple leather-hulled currach with a band of fellow monks. His account, written centuries later, is a masterpiece of early Christian literature mixed with ancient Celtic Imram voyage tales. He describes encountering talking birds that were really fallen angels, sailing past crystalline pillars that held up the sky, and landing on the back of a giant sea monster mistaken for an island. The culmination of his journey was the discovery of a beautiful, fertile land overflowing with lush vegetation and precious gems, which he named the Promised Land of the Saints. This was not just an island, it was a terrestrial paradise, a foretaste of heaven itself, granted to him by God for his piety and courage. For medieval cartographers and sailors, St. Brendan's Isle was a factual place. It appeared on countless maps, including the famous Martin Behaim globe from 1492, often placed west of the Canary Islands. Its existence was taken so seriously that it was even included in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, the agreement between Spain and Portugal that divided the entire unexplored world between them. The Phantom Island was considered a real possession to be respected. The legend provided a powerful spiritual framework for the act of exploration itself. To venture into the unknown, trackless ocean was an act of faith, a pilgrimage into the literal and metaphorical darkness. The potential reward was not just material wealth, but divine revelation. The ocean was no longer just an empty expanse of terror. It was a pathway to a promised land, a testing ground where faith could literally discover new worlds. The enduring power of these phantom islands lies in what they represent, the eternal human struggle between fear and curiosity. The vast, dark, and unpredictable ocean was the ultimate unknown, a place of storms, sea monsters, and certain death for the unprepared. To chart a solid landmass in the middle of that void was a psychological anchor, a way to make the unimaginable expanse seem just a little smaller, a little less hostile. These islands were promises of shelter in a storm, promises of fresh water and food after weeks of hardtack and thirst, promises of wealth for the ambitious and salvation for the pious. They were the cartographic manifestation of hope drawn onto the map because the alternative, a blank, empty, endless sea, was simply too terrifying to contemplate. They are a testament to the fact that the greatest maps ever drawn are not those that show us only what is there, but those that reveal what we desperately need to believe is there, shining like a beacon in the eternal night of the deep. In the shadowy world of medieval herbology, no plant was more sought after or more feared than the mandrake. This was not due to its unassuming appearance as a root, but because of its uncanny and terrifying resemblance to the human form. Forked and gnarled, the mandrake root often looked like a miniature person with distinct arms, legs, and even a head. This resemblance, known as the doctrine of signatures, the belief that God had marked plants with a sign to show their purpose, convinced people that the mandrake held immense power. It was a plant that blurred the line between vegetable and human, and harvesting it was not a simple matter of digging. It was a ritual that flirted with death itself. The core of the mandrake's dread was its legendary scream. It was widely believed that when the root was torn from the earth, it would emit a shriek of such pure, agonizing potency that it could shatter stone, drive men to instant madness, and kill anyone unfortunate enough to hear it. This was not a superstition taken lightly. It was recorded in serious pharmacological and botanical texts for centuries. The scream transformed the mandrake from a simple plant into a sentient, vengeful being. To harvest it was to commit a form of murder, and the plant would take its final revenge on its executioner. This belief provided a darkly logical explanation for the very real dangers of handling the plant, as all parts of the mandrake are highly toxic and can cause hallucinations, accelerated heart rate, and even fatal poisoning upon ingestion or sometimes even skin contact. The scream was likely a folkloric interpretation of these physiological effects on an unprepared harvester. This deadly risk necessitated an elaborate and macabre harvesting ritual, one that required a tragic intermediary. The prescribed method, described in texts as early as the 1st century by historians like Josephus and still firmly believed in the medieval period, involved the use of a dog. A would-be harvester, having located a mature mandrake plant at the dead of night under a full moon, would first plug their own ears thoroughly with wax or cloth. They would then tie one end of a long rope to the stem of the plant and the other end to a hungry dog. From a safe distance, the person would then throw a piece of meat just beyond the dog's reach. The desperate, starving animal would lunge for the food, pulling the mandrake root violently from the ground with its full strength. The root would unleash its fatal scream, a sound heard only by the dog, which would immediately convulse and die as the price for the harvest. The human, protected by their earplugs, could then safely approach and collect the now silent root, which had to be purified through specific washing rituals before it could be used. Once secured, the mandrake's powers were as dualistic as its nature. It was one of the most potent ingredients in the medieval apothecary's arsenal. In small, carefully measured doses, it was a powerful sedative and analgesic, used to dull the agony of surgery or to treat various ailments. Its association with its human-like form made it a central component in fertility rituals and potions. Couples would often dress the root in tiny clothes, place it in a special box, and feed it regularly in the belief it would help them conceive a child. This connection to creation, however, was perfectly balanced by a connection to destruction. In the hands of a witch or a necromancer, the mandrake was an essential tool for dark magic. It was believed to be a key ingredient in flying ointments, those hallucinogenic salves that induced trance-like states and out-of-body experiences. It could be used to create powerful love filters, what we would call love potions, that could bend another's free will to the user's desire. It could also be used in malevolent curses, its human shape making it a perfect effigy for sympathetic magic to harm an enemy from afar. The mandrake, therefore, embodied the ultimate medieval paradox, a single object that could grant life or deal death, offer divine blessing or demonic curse, all depending on the intentions of the hand that held it. But the terror of a single doppelganger or a cursed object pales next to the fear of an entire community simply ceasing to exist. Our next story transports us from the medieval world to the stark, frozen landscape of the Canadian Arctic in the early 20th century, yet its chilling core is woven from threads of a much older, more primal dread. In November of 1930, a fur trapper and prospector named Joe Bell, a man familiar with the harsh rhythms of the North, arrived at a small Inuit village on the shores of the remote Angakuni Lake. This was a settlement he had visited many times before, a place known for its hospitality, where the communal igloos and tents were always a welcome sight against the unforgiving expanse. But on this visit, he was met with a silence so profound it was louder than any storm. The village was empty, not a single soul stirred. The fishing nets were still set, a pot of caribou stew hung over a long-dead fire, frozen solid, and the prized sled dogs of the community were found a short distance away, all dead of starvation, still tied to a tree. Most haunting of all were the graves. The village had a small cemetery, and Labelle discovered that each and every burial cairn had been opened from the inside, the bodies of the ancestors removed without a trace. An entire community of people had seemingly vanished into the thin, cold air, leaving behind every possession and any logical explanation. While the Angakuni Lake vanishing is a modern mystery, its power comes from how perfectly it mirrors a deep-seated archetype in medieval folklore, the theme of the collective disappearance. Long before this event, cultures across Europe told stories of villages, armies, or entire populations that were swallowed by the earth, enchanted into a centuries-long sleep, or stolen away by otherworldly forces. In Wales, the legend of the lost kingdom of Cantre Gwaelod tells of a fertile land protected by a dike, which was drowned in a single night when a drunken watchman failed to close the gates against the rising tide, its bells still said to ring from beneath the waves. In Germany, stories circulated of the phantom army of King Barbarossa, sleeping inside the Kyffhäuser mountain, waiting for the right time to emerge. And in countless British and Celtic tales, entire fairy markets or elf feasts would appear to mortals on a misty night, only to vanish at the first light of dawn, leaving the witness disoriented and unsure if what they saw was ever real. These stories served as explanations for abandoned settlements, strange geological formations, or simply the unsettling feeling of emptiness in a particular place. The Angakuni event tapped directly into this ancient vein of fear. Without radios or easy communication, the remote north was a vast unknown, a blank space on the map where the rules of the modern world seemed to hold little sway. It was a landscape where the old stories still felt possible. The details of the scene, the uneaten food, the untied boats, the starved dogs, suggested a departure that was both instantaneous and involuntary. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of an animal attack or a rival tribe's raid. The violated graves, however, pointed toward something supernatural, something that respected no taboos. This single detail transformed the event from a potential human tragedy into something far more uncanny, aligning it with medieval beliefs about the restless dead or the power of demonic forces to command the deceased. Inuit culture itself possesses its own rich tapestry of myths that could provide a framework for such an event. There are stories of the Kalupilluit, monstrous, troll-like creatures that live under the ice and steal away children who wander too close to the water's edge. Other tales speak of spirits or forces that can lead even experienced hunters astray, causing them to become hopelessly lost in a white out just feet from their own homes, a phenomenon that could easily be scaled up to an entire village. The most chilling interpretation, and one that aligns with many medieval European sensibilities, is that the village broke a sacred taboo and faced a supernatural retribution so complete it erased them from existence. Perhaps they disturbed an ancient burial ground or offended a powerful spirit of the land. Their punishment was not just death, but absolute nullification, their very memory scrubbed from the location as if they had never been. Skeptics have, of course, proposed rational explanations. The most plausible theory suggests the villagers, facing sudden starvation due to a failed caribou migration or an illness, made a collective decision to abandon the settlement quickly to seek help or a new food source, and met with a tragic accident on the trail, such as falling through thin ice on the lake. The graves could have been desecrated by scavenging animals like wolverines. Yet, these logical conclusions struggle against the deeply unsettling nature of the evidence. Why leave all your weapons and tools behind if you are embarking on a perilous journey? How could every single person, including the elderly and infants, have perished without leaving a single trace on the trail? The lack of any bodies, then or since, is the detail that fuels the myth and solidifies its connection to those ancient stories of collective vanishing. The Angakuni Lake incident endures not because it is the most well-documented mystery, but because it is the perfect modern vessel for one of our oldest fears: the idea that the darkness, whether it be that of a medieval forest or an Arctic night, does not just contain individual monsters, but has the power to simply reach out and take everyone, leaving behind only the eerie artifacts of a life interrupted and a silence that asks questions we can never answer. Yet for all its compelling modernity, the event in Devon was far from unique. It was merely one of the most documented chapters in a much older, darker story. The medieval world was saturated with the belief that demons, spirits, and otherworldly beings were not just ethereal phantoms, but physical entities that could interact with our world and leave behind tangible proof of their passage. Long before the Devon Panic, communities across Europe had chronicled similar, chilling occurrences. In 1285, a chronicler in England wrote of mysterious black hounds leaving scorched, burning paw prints on the stone floors of a monastery. In the Swiss Alps, legends told of a spectral huntsman whose ghostly entourage would leave behind ice-cold, ember-like hoof prints on high mountain passes after a storm. These were not seen as random natural phenomena. They were interpreted as signs, as physical evidence of a nocturnal incursion from a demonic realm. A single, inexplicable mark found near a village well could be enough to spark a local panic, a fast, and desperate prayers for protection. The logic was consistent. If the devil and his minions could walk among the flock, then they could certainly leave their footprints behind as a mocking sign of their trespass. The sheer scale of the Devon phenomenon, however, set it apart and forced a frantic search for a rational explanation that still continues today. The natural world offered several compelling suspects, each with its own merits and flaws. One prominent theory pointed the finger at badgers, whose gait can create a somewhat straight, single-file line of prints that might appear unusual to an untrained eye. However, this theory struggles to account for the reported 8-mile span of the trail, or the fact that it hopped over 2-mile-wide estuaries and scaled sheer walls. Another candidate was an escaped kangaroo, an exotic animal that could have been part of a traveling menagerie. Its powerful hind legs could explain the leaping motion and the singular line of tracks, but no such escape was ever reported, and a single kangaroo could not possibly have covered such a vast distance in a single stormy night. Other theories have ranged from the experimental flight of a hot air balloon trailing a rope that left marks, though no such flight was recorded, to the more outlandish suggestion of a stray weather balloon or even, in later retellings, a visit from extraterrestrial beings. Perhaps the most scientifically plausible explanation, and one that connects back to older folkloric fears, involves the phenomenon of atmospheric plasma, specifically a rare and poorly understood event known as ball lightning or charged, rolling spheres of energy. A renowned British astronomer, Sir Patrick Moore, once proposed that a localized electrical plasma discharge from a storm could have superheated pockets of snow as it bounced across the landscape, creating a periodic, single line of melted holes that then refroze into the apparent shape of hoof prints. This theory elegantly explains the trail's impossible geometry, its ability to leap over obstacles, and its appearance following a night of electrical storms. To a terrified population in 1855, such a bizarre natural event would have been utterly incomprehensible. The only framework they had to process it was the one they had inherited from their medieval ancestors, the unmistakable sign of a demonic visitor, a physical manifestation of the Prince of Darkness himself taking a midnight stroll through the English countryside to survey his domain and test the faith of its people. Ultimately, the true power of the Devil's Footprints myth lies not in identifying the culprit, but in what the event reveals about the human psyche when confronted with the utterly inexplicable. The incident occurred at a fascinating crossroads in history, a time when scientific rationalism was rapidly ascending but had not yet fully displaced the deep-seated supernatural beliefs of the past. The newspapers of the day, themselves a relatively new mass medium, reported the story with a mixture of sensationalism and genuine terror, amplifying the panic far beyond the local villages. The event became a Rorschach test for an entire society. For the devout, it was a sobering reminder of the devil's pervasive presence. For the emerging scientific class, it was a puzzle to be solved with observation and hypothesis. For everyone else, it was simply a terrifying mystery that proved the night still held powers beyond human understanding. The footprints served as a stark reminder that no matter how advanced we become, a single, strange mark in the snow is enough to make us glance over our shoulder into the darkness, wondering what invisible visitor might have just passed us by. High in the misty peaks of North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains, a phenomenon has been witnessed for centuries that defies all easy explanation. A silent light show that has sparked wonder, fear, and countless theories. These are the Brown Mountain Lights, faint, multicolored orbs that appear and disappear without warning, dancing along the ridges, floating high into the air, or darting between the trees before vanishing as mysteriously as they came. While documented sightings exploded in the 20th century, the lights are not a modern mystery. Their story is deeply rooted in the medieval mindset of the indigenous peoples and early European settlers, a testament to the universal human need to explain the unexplainable with the stories of the eternal night. Long before the first European explorers set foot in the Appalachians, the Cherokee people had their own rich explanations for the strange illuminations. One of the most poignant legends tells of a great battle fought against a rival tribe on the slopes of Brown Mountain in the 16th century. The fighting was fierce and brutal, with heavy losses on both sides. As the story goes, the lights are the torches of the Cherokee women, searching the dark mountainside for their husbands, fathers, and sons who never returned from the conflict. Their search is eternal, a spectral vigil that continues night after night, a forever reminder of the cost of war. In another version, the lights are the spirits of the warriors themselves, forever condemned to reenact their final battle, their ghostly campfires and flaming arrows still visible across the centuries. These interpretations fit a common pattern in folklore worldwide. Mysterious lights are often the souls of those who met a tragic or untimely end, unable to find peace and forever bound to the site of their demise. For the Cherokee, the lights were not a random curiosity. They were a sacred, somber part of the landscape's spiritual tapestry, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was perceptibly thin. When Scots, Irish, and German settlers began moving into the region in the 18th and 19th centuries, they brought with them their own deeply ingrained medieval European folklore. They saw the same lights but through a different cultural lens. To these settlers, the wilderness was a dark and threatening place filled with unknown dangers. The flickering lights immediately recalled old-world tales of will-o'-the-wisps and ghostly lanterns held by lost souls or mischievous fairies. They spun new tales to explain the mystery, stories that mirrored the fears and hardships of frontier life. One popular legend told of a faithful slave who went searching for his missing master on Brown Mountain, carrying a lantern. When neither man returned, the slave's lantern became one of the eternal lights, still swinging as he continues his futile search. Another story spoke of a murdered peddler whose body was robbed and hidden, and whose spirit now roams the ridge with a lantern, perhaps seeking justice or simply doomed to wander. These settler myths, like the Cherokee tales before them, used the framework of the supernatural to process very real human tragedies, loss, violence, and the perilous uncertainty of life on the edge of the unknown. The scientific community, of course, has spent over a century trying to pin down a rational cause for the lights, with explanations ranging from the mundane to the complex. Early investigators proposed simple answers like car headlights from distant roads, train headlamps, or even the flickering campfires of moonshiners trying to avoid the law. While these sources certainly account for some misidentified sightings, they fail to explain the numerous reports that predate the automobile and the railroad by generations. More recent theories point to geological causes, specifically the piezoelectric effect, where certain minerals like quartz can generate small electrical charges when subjected to mechanical stress, such as the shifting of tectonic plates along the Linville Fault. This could theoretically produce brief, faint flashes of light. Another persistent theory involves the spontaneous combustion of marsh gases like methane released from the mountain's rocky faults, though the consistent reappearance in the same specific location makes this less likely. The United States Geological Survey has even conducted official studies concluding that the lights are a genuine, though unexplained, phenomenon. Despite these efforts, no single theory has been able to account for the full breadth of the sightings, their peculiar movements, or their ancient provenance. The lights remain stubbornly unexplained, a blank space on the map of our understanding. This enduring mystery is what gives the Brown Mountain Lights their true power. They are a perfect example of a liminal phenomenon, an event that exists on the threshold between the known and the unknown. In the medieval world, which lacked our scientific vocabulary, that threshold was populated by spirits, ghosts, and demons. The lights were given a narrative, a reason for being that helped people sleep at night, even if that story was a frightening one. Today, we have more tools to investigate, but the lights continue to resist them, retaining their mystery. They represent a direct link to how our ancestors viewed the world, not as a collection of mechanical processes, but as a living, breathing, and often sentient entity, capable of displaying its mysteries for those willing to look into the darkness. The lights force us to confront the limits of our knowledge, reminding us that even in our age of illumination, there are still pockets of the eternal night that hold their secrets close, flickering just beyond the reach of our understanding. While the tombs of the pharaohs lay along the Nile, the fear of their curses took root an ocean away, germinating in the superstitious soil of medieval Europe. This myth is a fascinating story of cross-cultural interpretation, where the treasures of an ancient civilization were viewed not with academic curiosity, but through a lens of deep supernatural dread. Long before Howard Carter's famous discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, European travelers, crusaders, and traders had been bringing Egyptian artifacts back from their journeys: scarabs, papyri, amulets, and mummies. These objects were utterly alien to the medieval mind. They were covered in hieroglyphics, a language that had been unreadable for over 1,000 years, and their purpose was completely mysterious. To a European world used steeped in Christian morality and a fear of demonic forces, these strange items were not historical curiosities. They were inherently pagan and therefore inherently dangerous. The intricate symbols were not seen as writing, but as powerful magical sigils, and the preserved bodies were not honored dead, but monstrous perversions of the natural order, a clear sign of dark sorcery. The concept of a curse specifically protecting a tomb resonated powerfully with existing medieval beliefs about the sanctity of grave goods and the consequences of disturbing the dead. In European folklore, to rob a grave was not just a crime, it was a sacrilege that could bring a terrible supernatural reckoning. Ghosts would haunt those who stole their burial shroud, and spirits would curse those who pocketed a coin meant for the ferryman. When tales trickled back from the east of Arabic explorers who had fallen ill or met misfortune after breaking into ancient Egyptian burial sites, Europeans had a ready-made framework to understand it. They seamlessly grafted these foreign accounts onto their own superstitions, creating a potent new hybrid legend, the Curse of the Pharaohs. It was believed that the priests of this ancient heathen empire had used their formidable magical arts to weave powerful spells of protection around their divine kings, spells that would punish any transgressor with disease, madness, or death, regardless of time or distance. This myth reached its peak of cultural power not in the deserts of Egypt, but in the great halls and curiosity cabinets of Renaissance Europe. A bizarre and macabre trend emerged: mummy unwrapping parties. Wealthy aristocrats would acquire a mummy, often ground into a powder and sold as a dubious medicinal cure, but sometimes a complete specimen. They would then host a social event where the linen wrappings were ceremoniously cut away to reveal the desiccated body within, treating the sacred funerary rite of a lost culture as a form of morbid entertainment. For the guests attending these spectacles, the tension was palpable. They were not just watching a dissection, they were participating in a ritual violation, and the legend of the curse hung heavy in the air. Every cough that followed, every piece of bad luck that befell a guest in the ensuing weeks, was potentially seen as the delayed vengeance of the pharaohs, a mystical retribution that had crossed continents and centuries to find them. The curse was a story that gave moral weight to what was, in reality, simple grave robbing on an industrial scale, a supernatural deterrent invented by the European conscience to explain the very real consequences of its own plunder. For the medieval sailor, the vast, trackless expanse of the North Sea was a realm of the eternal night long before the sun actually set. Shrouded in impenetrable fogs, battered by sudden, violent squalls, and cloaked in a darkness so profound it felt solid, these waters were the perfect breeding ground for a very specific kind of terror. It was here, in the howling void between known coastlines, that the legend of the ghost ship was born, a spectral warning that the sea itself was alive with supernatural dangers. The most infamous of these phantoms, of course, is the Flying Dutchman, but its story is merely the capstone on a vast and shadowy fleet of legends that haunted the medieval mariner's imagination. The core of the myth is always the same. A ship is seen, often in the midst of a gale or clinging to the edge of a fog bank, but something is terribly wrong. Its sails might be tattered, yet it moves against the wind. Its hull might be rotten and leaking, yet it refuses to sink. Or its deck might be utterly devoid of life, a ghostly crew silently guiding it to an unknown destination. The tale of the Flying Dutchman perfectly encapsulates this dread. As the story goes, a Dutch captain named Hendrik van der Decken was attempting to round the Cape of Good Hope during a monstrous storm. Determined to complete his voyage, he swore a blasphemous oath, vowing to pass the Cape even if it took him until the Day of Judgment. For his impiety and his hubris in defying the storm, a force widely believed to be an expression of God's will, he was condemned to exactly that. His ship, the Flying Dutchman, was cursed to never make port, forced to sail the world's oceans for eternity, a permanent prisoner of the very tempest he sought to conquer. Sightings of the vessel became the worst omen imaginable. To see its ghostly glow on the horizon was to receive a death sentence, a guarantee that your own ship would soon be joining it on the ocean floor. The myth served a profound moral purpose. It was a cautionary tale against the sins of pride and blasphemy, a stark reminder to every sailor that no man, no matter how skilled or determined, could ever truly master the sea. But the Dutchman was far from alone. The North Sea and the English Channel had their own local phantoms. Fishermen off the coast of Cornwall and Devon told of a massive, silent, three-masted schooner that would materialize from a fog bank, its name, the Lady Lovibond, just visible on its bow before it would vanish again. The legend claimed it was captained by a man who, in a fit of jealous rage on his wedding night, had deliberately sailed his ship and all its celebrating passengers onto the treacherous Goodwin Sands, dooming everyone aboard. Now, every 50 years, the entire ghastly wedding party is forced to reenact its final, tragic voyage. Further north, Scottish sailors dreaded the appearance of a burning longship. its sails and mast engulfed in silent, cold flames, which they believed was the spectral remains of a Viking raiding party that had been sent to the bottom by coastal defenders. These stories were not mere entertainment, they were vital navigational lore. The appearance of a specific ghost ship was often tied to a specific, deadly nautical feature, a sandbar, a reef, a whirlpool, serving as a supernatural lighthouse warning sailors to change course or face a very real and physical doom. These myths provided a crucial framework for understanding the very real and constant dangers of maritime life. In an age without weather forecasting, radio communication, or accurate charts, ships vanished with terrifying regularity. A vessel overdue in port might have been lost to a storm, captured by pirates, or wrecked on an uncharted rock. For the families left behind, the not knowing was a special kind of agony. The ghost ship legend offered a form of closure. It transformed an anonymous statistical tragedy into a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. To say that a ship had been seen merging with the fog, or that its crew had been glimpsed as silent, glowing figures on its deck, was to say that their fate was sealed by forces beyond human control. It was a way to confirm death in the absence of a body, and to assign a cosmic reason for a loss that otherwise felt random and cruel. The sea, in its immense and indifferent power, could erase a ship completely. The ghost ship myth was a refusal to be erased. It insisted that these lost vessels and their crews remained, forever sailing the border between the world of the living and the endless night of the deep, an eternal testament to every sailor who had answered the ocean's call and never returned. But if the ghost ship was a terror of the vast, open sea, our next myth brings the fear home, into the most intimate of spaces, the warmth of the hearth and the loyalty of a household pet. In the flickering firelight of a medieval cottage, a cat purrs contentedly on the lap of an old woman, or a dog lies faithfully at the feet of its master. These scenes of domestic comfort, however, held a sinister double meaning in an age gripped by the fear of witchcraft. To the suspicious eye, that cat was not a companion, it was a demon in disguise. That dog was not a protector, it was a spy for the devil. This was the pervasive and deeply personal terror of the witch's familiar, a belief that turned the most innocent of creatures into a vessel for supernatural evil and made every shadow in the corner a potential enemy. The concept of the familiar spirit, or imp, was central to the medieval understanding of how witchcraft worked. It was believed that when a person made a pact with the devil, they were not given vast cosmic power outright. Instead, they were assigned a low-ranking demon to act as their intermediary, a servant and guide in the dark arts. But these demons rarely appeared in their terrifying true forms. To move unnoticed through the human world and to forge a closer bond with the witch, they would take on the form of an animal. This is where the everyday world became haunted. A witch's familiar could be a cat, a dog, a toad, a hare, a rat, or even a seemingly innocuous insect like a bee or a moth. These creatures were not merely pets, they were the witch's source of power, her conduit to the demonic, and her active partner in crime. The roles these familiars played were described in chilling detail during the witch trials that swept across Europe and later into the American colonies. According to confessions often extracted under horrific torture, the imp would first assist the witch in casting her spells. A toad might be used in a potion to curse a neighbor's livestock. A black cat might be sent to silently enter a home and breathe a miasma of sickness onto a sleeping child. The familiar was also a spy, slipping into homes and gatherings to eavesdrop on conversations and report back to the witch. But perhaps its most important function was to nourish its master. In a grotesque inversion of the bond between human and animal, it was believed that witches suckled their familiars from a special witch's mark, an extra nipple, often hidden somewhere on their body, offering their own blood as sustenance to the demon in exchange for its services. This act sealed their infernal pact and was considered undeniable proof of guilt by witch hunters. This belief had devastating consequences for both people and animals. During the infamous witch trials conducted by Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witchfinder general in 17th century England, the presence of an animal was treated as primary evidence. Women were stripped and meticulously examined for the telltale witch's mark, and any pet they owned was considered a confirmed familiar. In one case, an elderly woman named Elizabeth Clark confessed to having 5 imps: a dog named Jarmara, a cat named Vinegar Tom, a rabbit named Saki and Sugar, and a polecat named News. These animals, once named and described, sealed her fate. They were often executed alongside their owners, burned or hanged as literal demons. The line between a beloved companion and a monstrous entity had been completely erased by the darkness of superstition. This paranoia preyed upon the most vulnerable members of society. Older women, often living alone on the margins of a village, frequently kept pets for companionship. Their knowledge of herbal remedies, passed down through generations, made them both valued community resources and objects of deep suspicion if anything went wrong. If a child fell ill after a woman was seen stroking her cat, the connection seemed obvious to a fearful neighbor. If a farmer's cow dried up after a woman with a dog begged for milk, her familiar must have cursed the animal. The familiar became the perfect explanatory tool for everyday misfortunes, a supernatural scapegoat that could be named, blamed, and ultimately destroyed. It was a belief that poisoned community trust, turning kindness to an animal into evidence of a demonic pact and ensuring that in the eternal night of fear, no one was ever truly alone, for even their most loyal friend could be a fiend in disguise. For an order founded on vows of poverty, the Knights Templar amassed a staggering level of wealth, a paradox that would fuel one of history's most enduring and tantalizing myths. As the premier financial and military power of the Crusades, they managed vast estates, pioneered early banking for pilgrims, and received immense donations from pious nobles across Europe. Yet when King Philip IV of France moved to destroy the order in 1307, seizing their assets to resolve his own crippling debts, the fabled Templar treasure was nowhere to be found. The official inventories revealed only a fraction of what was expected. This abrupt disappearance created a vacuum, and into that void rushed a legend that has captivated treasure hunters for 7 centuries. The myth of the hidden Templar hoard, protected not just by secret maps, but by a supernatural guard duty that stretches into eternity. The core of the legend posits that the Templars, forewarned of the king's betrayal, smuggled their most precious relics and chests of gold out of Paris under cover of darkness. Their vast fleet of ships, which vanished from the French port of La Rochelle, is said to have carried the treasure to remote, pre-prepared locations. In Scotland, Rosslyn Chapel becomes a potential vault, its intricate carvings not merely biblical scenes but a coded map to the treasure's resting place. On Canada's Oak Island, the complex flooding booby traps of the so-called money pit are attributed to Templar engineers determined to protect their secret. Yet these physical barriers are only the first layer of defense. The more powerful protection is spiritual. The stories claim that high-ranking knights, in a final act of loyalty, performed a sacred ritual binding their souls to the treasure they swore to protect. They did not simply hide the gold and die. They became its eternal sentinels, a spectral garrison cursed or blessed to stand watch until the order is absolved and their charge can be rightfully claimed. These guardians are not described as shuffling zombies or mindless wraiths. They are the Templars as they were in life, formidable, unwavering, and clad in the ghostly white mantles adorned with the Red Cross. They are said to appear in the misty glens near proposed hiding places or patrol the corridors of ruined preceptories, their forms flickering between our world and the next. To encounter one is not necessarily to meet instant death, but to face a test. Some tales speak of the guardians presenting a series of theological or moral riddles that the seeker must answer correctly to pass. Others tell of a silent, imposing figure who simply points a spectral sword toward the intruder, a clear warning to turn back. The most chilling accounts, however, involve those who press on despite the warnings. These greedy souls are not struck down by a blade, but are driven mad by visions, lost in a supernatural maze, or found later babbling incoherently about endless tunnels and watching eyes, their minds broken by an encounter with a will stronger than their own avarice. This myth of the eternal guardian served a profound purpose in the medieval psyche, far beyond a simple scary story. The Templars' downfall was a monumental shock to Christendom. It was a story of sacred vows broken, of holiness corrupted by greed, and of a seemingly invincible institution brought low by worldly politics. The idea that their treasure survived and was protected by the knight's unbroken spirits was a powerful narrative correction. It transformed a story of utter defeat into one of enduring purpose. It suggested that the Order's true power was not ultimately in its land or gold, but in its unwavering faith and duty, a force so potent it could defy death itself. The curse was not one of malice, but of supreme loyalty, a final oath that could not be dissolved by a king's decree or an executioner's pyre. In a world where the church and monarchy had proven fallible and corruptible, the myth offered a vision of a purer, incorruptible power that answered to a higher law. The relentless, centuries-long search for the Templar treasure, still undertaken today with modern technology, is a testament to the myth's potent allure. It combines two of our most powerful desires, the lust for material wealth and the yearning for historical revelation. To find the treasure would be more than just getting rich. It would be to solve one of history's great mysteries, to validate the legends, and to finally answer the question of what truly happened to the lost knights. The myth of the Eternal Guardian adds a crucial layer of stakes to this quest. It means the seeker is not just digging for gold, they are challenging a 700-year-old vow. They are testing their own worthiness against the idealized virtue of the medieval warrior monk. The treasure is not merely hidden, it is reserved, waiting for someone who possesses not just a map, but the courage, purity, or perhaps the divine right to face its otherworldly protectors and prove themselves the true heir to the legacy of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. From the spectral guardians of lost treasure to the cursed object that could turn a man invisible, the 30 myths we've explored together form a magnificent tapestry woven from the deepest fears and boldest imaginations of the medieval world. Each story, in its own way, represents a profound and very human attempt to impose order on the terrifying chaos of the unknown. Long before the reassuring glow of electric light, the night was a vast and boundless canvas. Its darkness was not empty, it was alive with possibility. Every unexplained sound in the forest, every sudden illness with no cure, every mysterious light in the swamp, and every ship that failed to return to port demanded an explanation. Without the framework of modern science, our ancestors turned to the only tools they had: narrative, symbolism, and a rich spiritual belief system that saw the divine and the demonic in every shadow. These myths were their science, their psychology, and their way of mapping the most frightening territories of both the world and the human heart. What is truly captivating is how these stories consistently give a face and a name to abstract fears. The terror of a plague becomes the vampire, a neighbor risen from the grave to prey on their own family. The heartbreak of a child's wasting illness is transformed into the chilling logic of the changeling, a story that allowed parents to fight back against a fairy kidnapper rather than succumb to helpless grief. The inexplicable violence of a storm is personified as the Wild Hunt, a spectral army raging across the sky with a leader and a purpose. Even the simple act of breaking a promise is given cosmic weight in the Pied Piper's tale, where a town's hypocrisy leads to the utter loss of its future. These legends are not mere superstitions, they are powerful coping mechanisms, narrative engines designed to process tragedy, enforce social order, and answer the most unanswerable questions of life and death. And yet, these stories are far more than relics of a bygone era. They continue to captivate us because they speak to universal, timeless anxieties that still resonate in the modern human experience. The fear of the dark is at its core a fear of the unseen, of what we cannot know, control, or understand. Today, our eternal night might be the vastness of deep space, the mysteries of the subconscious mind, or the ominous potential of artificial intelligence. We may have replaced the-Wisps with eerie quantum phenomena and the curse of a pharaoh with the unsettling potential of a genetic mutation, but the fundamental human impulse remains unchanged. We are still storytellers seeking patterns and reasons in the chaos, and the medieval myths provide the foundational archetypes for the monsters we still imagine lurking at the edges of our understanding. They remind us that our need for wonder and our capacity for fear are two sides of the same ancient coin. This journey through the eternal night is one we can all continue together. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these 30 myths sent the deepest chill down your spine? Was it the relentless pursuit of the Headless Horseman, the deceptive glow of the will-o'-the-Wisp, or the tragic, eternal wandering of the lost souls we met along the way? Perhaps you have a local legend from your own part of the world, a story of the dark passed down through generations that we didn't cover. Share your favorite myth from the eternal night down in the comments below. Let's keep the stories alive, because as long as there are shadows, there will always be tales whispered within them, connecting us across the centuries to everyone who has ever gazed into the darkness and dared to imagine